The most depraved act in a Ptolemaic bedroom had nothing to do with sex, and everything to do with a box, a birthday, and the dismembered body of a queen's own son. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here with me. Let's take a moment together, you and I, to get comfortable, because what I'm about to share with you isn't the history you might expect. This isn't about exotic seductions or scandalous affairs. This is about something far more disturbing. Inside that box, carefully arranged like some grotesque puzzle, were the severed pieces of a 12-year-old boy. His name was Ptolemy Memphis. His mother was Cleopatra II, Queen of Egypt. His father was the one who ordered the butchering. And the occasion? Her birthday. We need to understand something fundamental here. When we talk about the perversions of ancient rulers, our modern minds leap to sexual excess. But the true perversion of the Ptolemaic dynasty wasn't what happened between silk sheets. It was what happened when family became the battlefield, when children became weapons, when love itself became a tool of war. So, let's settle in together. There won't be any tests at the end of this. No judgments about what you do or don't remember. We're simply going to walk through 3 centuries of a dynasty where survival meant something very different from what it means to us today. Where queens named Cleopatra, and there were 7 of them, fought not just for power but for the very right to exist. We'll discover how a mother could sit across from her son's killer at dinner, how she could share his bed again, how she could rule beside him as if those pieces in that box had never existed. Because the forces at work here go deeper than personal grief. They touch something primal about power itself. And we'll see how this story, this real story of calculated cruelty, became buried under centuries of Roman propaganda. How the last Cleopatra, the 7th of her name, inherited not just a throne but a legacy of survival that Rome could never understand. A legacy that terrified them so much they had to rewrite it entirely. By the time we're finished, you'll understand why the most powerful empire on earth feared a single woman. You'll see how stories can be weapons more deadly than armies. And perhaps most unsettling of all, you'll recognize patterns that echo through every age, including our own. But let's begin where all nightmares begin, with a birthday present no mother should ever receive. So we're going to move through time together, you and I, starting 300 years before that terrible birthday. We'll walk the marble halls where 7 different Cleopatras learned to survive. We'll stand in throne rooms where mothers plotted against daughters, where brothers married sisters not for love but for legitimacy. Each generation teaching the next a simple truth. In the Ptolemaic court, family was your greatest threat. We'll witness transformations that would seem impossible if they weren't documented in papyrus and stone. Women who endured unspeakable losses, who sat at feasts with their children's killers, who found ways to turn grief itself into a kind of armor, because what other choice did they have? The throne of Egypt demanded sacrifices that would break most of us. Think of it as archaeology of the heart. We're excavating layers of calculated cruelty, each stratum revealing new depths of what humans can endure when power is at stake. And with each Cleopatra we meet, we'll see the lessons accumulating, the strategies refining, until we reach that 7th and final queen who would terrify Rome itself. The journey ahead contains moments that will make you pause, moments where you might need to set this aside, take a breath, return when you're ready. That's perfectly natural. These aren't comfortable truths we're approaching, but they're necessary ones, because they show us something fundamental about how stories shape our understanding of the past, and how the past shapes our present. By walking this path together, we'll uncover why that box, that birthday, that dismembered child, represents something far more disturbing than any sexual scandal could ever be. We'll see how power corrupts not just individuals but entire bloodlines, how it seeps into the very DNA of dynasties until cruelty becomes tradition. And when we emerge on the other side, you'll carry with you a different kind of knowledge. Not just facts and dates, but an understanding of how human beings adapt to the unthinkable, how they survive, how they transform, how they become the very monsters they once feared. Before any queen could rule, she first had to survive her own family. The Ptolemaic dynasty was founded on a simple, yet terrifying principle. Power must never leave the bloodline. But what happens when the only way to keep the blood pure is to poison the family tree from the root? We need to step back 3 centuries before that terrible birthday box. Back to when Alexander's general first claimed Egypt as his prize. Ptolemy I faced a choice that would echo through generations. He could marry strategically, forming alliances with other kingdoms, or he could do something that even his Greek ancestors found disturbing. He chose isolation. He chose blood. Let's walk together through those cool marble halls of the early palace in Alexandria. The Mediterranean breeze carries salt and promise through columns designed to impress visiting dignitaries. But notice how few visitors actually come. The Ptolemies didn't want witnesses to what they were building. The tradition began innocently enough. Royal marriages between cousins, perfectly acceptable in the ancient world. Then, uncles marrying nieces. Each generation pushing the boundary a little further until the unthinkable became inevitable. Brothers would marry sisters, not as symbolic unions, but as real marriages that produced real children. The Egyptian priests approved. After all, their gods Isis and Osiris were siblings who married. What better way for Greek rulers to claim divine authority than to mirror the gods themselves? The native population could accept foreign rulers who honored ancient traditions, even this most disturbing one. But we need to understand something crucial here. This wasn't just about religious symbolism or political expedience. The sibling marriages created a unique psychological ecosystem within the palace walls. Think about your own childhood for a moment. Your earliest memories of siblings or cousins, the games you played, the fights you had, the secrets you shared. Now add a terrible knowledge to those innocent moments. From the age you could understand words, you knew. That boy pulling your hair would one day share your bed. That girl you competed with, for your mother's attention, would either be your wife or your deadliest rival. The nursery became a different kind of battlefield. Every Ptolemaic child learned to read faces before they could read hieroglyphs. Was that smile from your brother genuine affection, or was he already calculating whether you'd be useful as an ally or better eliminated as a threat? When your sister shared her honeycakes with you, was it kindness or an early political alliance? The first Cleopatra enters our story here, though she bore only the title of queen, not yet the name that would haunt Roman nightmares. She was Cleopatra VII, a foreign princess who married into this increasingly insular dynasty. She must have noticed how different her new family was from the Syrian court she'd known, how the palace children watched each other with eyes too knowing for their years. She tried to protect her own children from the worst of it, but protection in the Ptolemaic court meant teaching them to survive, not sheltering them from harsh realities. Her daughter would marry her son. This was already decided, carved into the very architecture of dynastic planning. The wedding ceremonies themselves became elaborate performances of denial, priests chanting about divine unions, while everyone present knew these siblings had shared the same wet nurse. The bride and groom exchanging vows they'd practiced in the nursery. Sometimes the girl was barely past her first blood. The boy might be years younger, waiting to consummate until he reached an appropriate age. We have papyrus records from these ceremonies, administrative documents that reveal the horrifying mundanity of it all. Marriage contracts listing the joint property of 12-year-old brides and 10-year-old grooms, inventories of wedding gifts that read like nursery supplies, gold rattles alongside fertility amulets. But the real perversion wasn't the marriages themselves, it was what they produced. Each generation became more isolated, more paranoid, more willing to see family as threat rather than support. The gene pool narrowed, but more importantly, the emotional pool became a stagnant pond where only the most ruthless could avoid drowning. Children raised in this system developed what we might recognize today as profound attachment disorders. How do you form healthy bonds when your first playmate might order your execution? How do you trust when betrayal is baked into your bloodline? The palace physicians left records too, though they're careful never to directly criticize the divine rulers. They speak obliquely of melancholic humors that seem to afflict each generation more severely, of young princes who refused to eat unless their food was tested by slaves, of princesses who kept daggers under their pillows and trusted only the deaf-mute servants who couldn't repeat their secrets. This was the inheritance of every Cleopatra who would follow, not just a throne or a treasury, but a legacy of learned cruelty wrapped in divine mandate. Let me share with you a scene that captures the reality beneath the royal pageantry. A court scribe, recording what he thought was a charming family moment, preserved something far more chilling. The second Ptolemy, the one who formalized sibling marriage as policy, was teaching his children to play senet, the ancient board game. The boy, barely 6, captured his sister's piece and declared, "Now you're dead." The girl, perhaps 8, responded without missing a beat, "Only if you eat dinner tonight." Their father laughed. The scribe recorded it as a delightful example of royal wit. But we can read between the hieroglyphs, can't we? Even in play, these children rehearsed elimination. Even in games, they practiced survival. This was the soil from which 7 Cleopatras would grow, each one learning from the last that family meant danger, that love was leverage, that the only way to survive your relatives was to be willing to destroy them first. The priests kept insisting these unions were sacred, blessed by the gods. But the palace servants, the ones who cleaned the blood from marble floors and disposed of poisoned wine cups, they knew better. They passed down their own stories in whispers, tales of midnight screams and morning disappearances. By the time we reached the 3rd generation of sibling marriages, something fundamental had shifted in the palace. The Ptolemaic children no longer played at being gods. They played at being survivors. Their games involved poison detection and alliance building. Their bedtime stories were cautionary tales of aunts who trusted too much, and uncles who smiled while sharpening knives. And yet the system persisted, because it worked, in its own twisted way. The Ptolemies kept power concentrated, kept wealth within the family, kept foreign influence at bay. Egypt remained rich and relatively stable while other Hellenistic kingdoms fractured and fell. The price was paid in private, in children who learned to fear their own shadows, in marriages that were battlegrounds, in a palace where every meal might be your last and every smile hid calculation. This was the world Cleopatra II inherited, born into a dynasty where your brother husband might dismember your child and send you the pieces, where such an act wasn't madness but method, where survival meant becoming the very monster you feared. But she would learn something her predecessors hadn't. She would discover that there were things worse than death, and weapons more terrible than knives. She would take the lessons written in her family's blood and transform them into something even the gods hadn't anticipated. This system bred a unique kind of monster, and its first great test would come with a queen who refused to break, even when they sent her own son back to her in pieces. The name Cleopatra conjures one famous face, but a century before her, another Cleopatra wrote the playbook for survival in a world determined to break her. Cleopatra II entered life with advantages her descendants could only dream of. Born around 193 BCE, she wasn't yet trapped in the full horror of sibling marriage. Her father, Ptolemy V, had married a foreign princess. Her mother brought Syrian blood into the dynasty, a brief respite from the genetic spiral that would soon resume its terrible course. We can almost see her in those early years, a girl racing through palace corridors in Alexandria, her sandals slapping against marble floors that had known 3 generations of Ptolemaic feet. The Mediterranean sun streaming through windows designed to catch every breeze. Peacocks calling from the gardens, where she learned which plants healed and which ones killed. Her childhood tutors noted an unusual quality in the young princess. Where other royal children showed either cruelty or weakness, she displayed something rarer: watchfulness. The ability to read the palace's hidden currents like a sailor reads weather. She understood early that in these halls, neutrality was its own form of power. The lessons came dressed as luxury, dancing instructors who taught her to move with grace while scanning for exits, language teachers who showed her how words could wound or soothe, depending on inflection. Even her mathematics tutor embedded survival in his equations, showing how to calculate food supplies for sieges, how to divide loyalty among fractious generals. But the real education came from watching her parents. Her father, Ptolemy V, had survived his own childhood through spectacular violence. Crowned at 5 years old after his mother was burned alive by a mob, he'd learned that mercy invited murder. Her mother, Cleopatra I, brought different lessons from the Syrian court. She showed her daughter how foreign queens survived through adaptation, becoming more Egyptian than the natives while keeping escape routes always in mind. Together, they gave their daughter a unique perspective. She saw both the indigenous cruelty of the Ptolemaic system and the possibility of something different, not better necessarily, but different, more flexible, more sustainable. When she turned 14, the marriage negotiations began. This was expected, even welcomed. Marriage meant leaving the palace, establishing her own power base. But the gods had other plans, or rather, her brothers did. She had two of them. Ptolemy VI, older by 3 years, already showing signs of the weakness that would define his reign, and Ptolemy VIII, younger but infinitely more dangerous, with eyes that calculated odds while his mouth smiled pleasantries. The law said she must marry the elder. Tradition demanded it, but already she could see the problem brewing. Ptolemy VI might wear the crown, but Ptolemy VIII would never accept a secondary role. Most sisters would have chosen a side, betting their future on one brother's success. Cleopatra II did something unprecedented. She chose both. The triple wedding shocked even the jaded Alexandrian court. 1 bride, 2 grooms, 3 crowns, shared in an arrangement that had no precedent in Ptolemaic history. The priests scrambled to find divine justification. The foreign ambassadors sent confused reports home, but Cleopatra II understood what others missed. In a family where brothers routinely murdered each other, forcing them to share power might be the only way to prevent bloodshed. The wedding night itself became legend, though not for the reasons Roman historians would later imagine. The 3 siblings sat in separate chambers, fully dressed, while lawyers negotiated the practical details of their arrangement: who would sleep where, who would appear at which ceremonies, how decisions would be made when they disagreed. Cleopatra II insisted on one crucial detail: the brothers would rotate monthly attendance at court, never together unless all 3 were present. It was brilliant in its simplicity. They couldn't plot against each other if they were never alone together, and she would always be there, the constant center around which they orbited. For a moment, it actually worked. The early years of the triple monarchy saw Egypt prosper. Ptolemy VI handled domestic affairs with surprising competence when not overshadowed by his brother. Ptolemy VIII led the military with the ruthlessness the position required, and Cleopatra II managed the delicate balance, soothing egos, redirecting ambitions, keeping the peace through sheer force of diplomatic will. She bore children to both brothers, though the palace records carefully avoid specifying which child belonged to which father. It didn't matter legally. They were all legitimate heirs to the Triple Crown. But it mattered in the nursery, where even toddlers learned to navigate the complex loyalty tests their existence represented. Foreign threats made the arrangement easier to maintain. The Seleucid Empire pressed against Egypt's borders. Nothing unites fractious siblings like external danger. The 3 presented a united front, their combined talents more formidable than any single ruler could manage. But we know, don't we, that such arrangements never last. The cracks appeared first in small ways. Ptolemy VIII staying an extra day at court during his brother's month. Ptolemy VI recruiting his own palace guards instead of relying on shared security. Little violations of their agreement that Cleopatra II smoothed over with increasing difficulty. She developed her own methods of control, not through violence or threats, but through something more subtle. She became indispensable. Every negotiation required her presence. Every diplomatic letter bore her seal alongside her brother's. She cultivated the priests, ensuring religious ceremonies couldn't proceed without the Queen's blessing. When foreign ambassadors arrived, she received them first, setting the tone for all subsequent meetings. Her brothers found themselves competing for her approval rather than against each other. It was a delicate dance, one that required constant adjustment and perfect balance. The palace servants whispered about the Queen's unusual habits, how she kept separate kitchens for each brother's preferences, how she maintained 3 different sets of royal apartments, decorated to each sibling's taste, how she could transform herself completely between meetings, becoming whatever version of queen each brother needed to see. Some called it cunning, others saw it as survival, but her children understood it differently. They watched their mother fragment herself daily to keep the peace. They saw the exhaustion she hid behind paint and jewels. They learned that in the Ptolemaic court, even love was performance. The arrangement lasted 12 years. 12 years of careful choreography, of managed jealousies, of prevented murders. By any measure, it was a spectacular success. Egypt avoided civil war. The economy flourished. The borders held. Then came the year when everything shattered. It started with a plague in the army camps. Ptolemy VIII, commanding the southern forces, fell ill. For 3 weeks, messengers rode daily between Memphis and Alexandria, updating the queen on her younger brother husband's condition. Ptolemy VI saw opportunity in his brother's weakness. He suggested, ever so carefully, that perhaps the Triple Crown was too heavy. Perhaps 2 would bear it better than 3. Cleopatra II faced an impossible choice. Support the brother present and healthy, potentially signing the death warrant for the one who lay fevered in Memphis, or maintain her neutrality and risk both brothers seeing her as an enemy. She chose a third option. She went to Memphis herself. The journey down the Nile took 5 days. 5 days when anything could happen in Alexandria. 5 days when Ptolemy VI could consolidate power, eliminate her supporters, rewrite the rules of their arrangement. Her advisors begged her not to go, but she understood something they didn't. The Triple Crown only worked because all 3 believed in it. The moment she chose sides, the balance would shatter. The only way to save it was to risk everything on her ability to heal more than bodies. She found Ptolemy VIII worse than the reports suggested. Fever had eaten away his famous strength. Delirium made him call for their mother, dead these 20 years. The army physicians had given up, preparing the embalming chambers for another royal corpse. Cleopatra II dismissed them all. For 3 days and nights she tended her brother husband herself, not with the exotic potions Roman historians would later imagine, but with simple care. Cool cloths on burning skin, honey water dripped between cracked lips, a familiar voice anchoring him to life when death seemed easier. On the 4th night, the fever broke. Ptolemy VIII opened lucid eyes to find his sister-wife queen beside him, haggard but triumphant. In that moment, something shifted in their complex relationship. Not love exactly. The Ptolemies had no word for that gentle emotion, but recognition, acknowledgement of what she'd risked to save him. They returned to Alexandria together, a powerful statement to any who'd hoped to profit from division. Ptolemy VI greeted them with public joy and private fury. The balance had held, but barely, and all 3 knew it couldn't last much longer. External pressures provided temporary distraction. Antiochus IV of Syria invaded, claiming Egypt for the Seleucids. The Triple Crown faced its greatest test. 2 brothers who could barely stand each other's presence had to coordinate military strategy while their sister-wife queen managed a capital in panic. This was Cleopatra II's finest hour. She turned the palace into a war room where both brothers could contribute without confrontation. She managed food distribution to prevent riots. She negotiated with Rome for support while keeping Egyptian independence intact. When Syrian forces reached the suburbs of Alexandria itself, she stood on the palace walls where the people could see her, a visible promise that their rulers hadn't fled. The invasion failed. Roman pressure and Egyptian resistance forced Antiochus to withdraw. The Triple Crown had survived external threat through unprecedented cooperation, but success in war only highlighted the impossibility of peace. Ptolemy VI, emboldened by victory, began asserting primary authority. Ptolemy VIII, recovered from his illness and remembering who'd saved him, nonetheless refused to accept subordinate status. Cleopatra II found herself not maintaining balance but merely delaying the inevitable explosion. Then Ptolemy VI died. The death was sudden, natural, the physicians insisted. A weak heart, overtaxed by the recent campaign. But in the Ptolemaic palace, natural death was as rare as virgin birth. Whispers followed the funeral procession. A servant mentioned strange-tasting wine. A physician noted unusual symptoms. Ptolemy VIII's public grief seemed perfectly calibrated, neither excessive nor insufficient. Cleopatra II faced a new reality. No more balance to maintain. No more careful choreography between competing brothers. Just her and the survivor, bound by law and custom, and the terrible knowledge of what might have actually happened in those final hours. The marriage that followed was different from anything before. Not the careful political arrangement of three equals, but something raw. Ptolemy VIII no longer needed to hide his nature. The brother who'd smiled while calculating odds now revealed the depths of his arithmetic, and his sister-wife Queen discovered that the boy she'd saved in Memphis had become something monstrous during those years of forced restraint. She was pregnant again. But this child would be different from the others. This one would be born into a court where balance was memory and brutality was method. This child would become the center of the most horrific birthday gift in ancient history. When her first husband died, she was forced into a new, far more dangerous union. The old queen was dead, the balance was broken, and Ptolemy VIII emerged from behind his mask of restraint like a crocodile surfacing from the Nile. Cleopatra II understood immediately what her survival would cost. The careful choreography of the Triple Crown had protected everyone, including Ptolemy VIII, from his own nature. Now nothing stood between Egypt and the appetites of a man who'd spent 12 years pretending to share. The coronation ceremony told its own story. Where once 3 thrones had stood in careful alignment, now only 2 remained. But even that was illusion. Ptolemy VIII positioned his throne slightly forward, forcing his sister-wife to sit just behind his right shoulder. A small thing, measured in finger widths, but in the symbolic language of royal power, it screamed subordination. She adapted, as she always had, but this adaptation required different skills. Where once she'd balanced competing egos, now she had to manage a single, overwhelming presence. Ptolemy VIII didn't want a partner, he wanted an audience. The changes came swiftly. Palace guards who'd served the Triple Crown found themselves replaced by men loyal only to the king. The careful rotation of duties that had prevented any faction from gaining too much power vanished overnight. Ptolemy VIII's supporters filled every position of importance. But the queen noticed something her husband missed in his rush to consolidate power. The people watched these changes with growing unease. In the markets of Alexandria, merchants muttered about the good old days of shared rule. In the temples, priests performed the required ceremonies, but with none of their former enthusiasm. Even the palace servants moved differently, their eyes downcast not from respect but from fear. Cleopatra II began her own quiet campaign. Not resistance exactly. That would have been suicide. Instead, she became the kingdom's memory. In small ways, through careful words and calculated gestures, she reminded Egypt what they'd lost. When petitioners came before the throne seeking justice, she would murmur just loudly enough to be heard, "Your late brother would have shown mercy in such a case." When foreign ambassadors presented themselves, she'd mention how efficiently the Triple Crown had handled similar negotiations. Never criticism, never direct comparison, just gentle reminders of a different way. Ptolemy VIII seemed not to notice at first, or perhaps he simply didn't care. His attention focused on military campaigns, expanding Egypt's borders through brutality rather than diplomacy. He spent months away from Alexandria, leaving his queen to manage domestic affairs. This suited Cleopatra II perfectly. In his absence, she could almost pretend the old balance still existed. She held court with something approaching her former authority. She distributed grain to the poor, funded temple restorations, adjudicated disputes with the wisdom she'd honed during the Triple Crown years. The people began to see what she wanted them to see. Their queen still cared for them. Their queen remembered when Egypt was governed by consensus rather than conquest. Their queen was one of them, in a way their increasingly distant king could never be. Then Ptolemy VIII would return, flush with victory and drunk on violence. The careful progress Cleopatra II had made would shatter against his presence, like waves against stone. He'd overturn her judgments, cancel her charitable programs, punish servants who'd grown too comfortable in his absence. She endured it all with a patience that unsettled even him. Where other queens might have raged or retreated, she simply adjusted. When he countermanded her orders, she found ways to achieve the same ends through different means. When he humiliated her in public, she transformed the humiliation into sympathy from observers. She was becoming something new, not just a survivor, but a symbol. The birth of their son should have been a moment of triumph. Ptolemy Memphites entered the world healthy and strong, a male heir to secure the dynasty. But Cleopatra II looked at her newborn and saw not continuation but complication. This child bound her to Ptolemy VIII in ways that simple marriage could not. He was leverage incarnate. As the boy grew, the divide between his parents deepened. Ptolemy VIII saw a future warrior, a prince to be hardened through trials. Cleopatra II saw a child who might bridge the growing gap between palace and people. Their different visions for young Memphites became another battlefield in their quiet war. The king would take his son to watch executions, teaching him that power meant the ability to end life at will. The queen would later find the boy in the gardens, showing him how the same hands that could kill could also heal, teaching him the medicinal properties of plants just as her tutors had once taught her. By the time Memphites reached his 10th year, he'd become a strange hybrid, capable of his father's coldness when necessary, but retaining something of his mother's ability to read the deeper currents of human need. In him, the best and worst of the Ptolemaic line seemed to war for dominance. Then came the summer of the riots. It started small, as these things always do. A tax collector in the harbour district proved too zealous in his duties. A fisherman's widow couldn't pay. The collector seized not just her boats but her children, selling them to cover the debt. By nightfall, the harbour burned. Ptolemy VIII responded with predictable brutality. Soldiers swept through the district, adding fresh bodies to the flames. But the violence spread rather than stop the unrest. Each new atrocity created 10 new rebels. Within a week, half of Alexandria seethed with barely contained rage. Cleopatra II watched from the palace walls as smoke rose from her city. She understood what her husband refused to see. This wasn't just about taxes or individual injustices. This was about a people who'd lost faith in their king, who remembered a different time, who looked to their queen for salvation. She made her choice. The proclamation appeared overnight. Papyrus sheets nailed to temple doors and market stalls throughout the city. In carefully chosen words, Cleopatra II declared herself the sole legitimate ruler of Egypt. Ptolemy VIII had violated the sacred trusts of kingship. The gods had withdrawn their favour. The queen stood with her people. By dawn, Alexandria erupted. Not in riot this time, but in celebration. Citizens poured into the streets shouting her name. Statues of Ptolemy VIII toppled from their pedestals. The palace guards, many of whom had served under the Triple Crown, quietly switched their allegiance. Ptolemy VIII woke to find himself king of a rebellion. Half the army remained loyal, but the other half remembered a queen who'd sat beside their campfires, who'd risked her life to save their general. The priests performed hasty divinations and declared the gods uncommonly silent on the matter. Even his own council seemed paralyzed, caught between legal loyalty and practical reality. For one extraordinary moment, Cleopatra II controlled Alexandria. She moved quickly to consolidate support, reducing taxes, freeing political prisoners, promising a return to consensual government. The people loved her for it. Flowers carpeted the streets when she ventured out. Children sang songs about the queen who chose them over her crown. But we know how these stories end in the house of Ptolemy, don't we? Ptolemy VIII didn't waste time on negotiation or attempts to win back support. He simply withdrew, took his most loyal forces and retreated to Cyprus, that island refuge where exiled Ptolemies had always plotted their returns. But he took something else with him. Someone else. Young Memphites had been visiting military camps outside the city when the rebellion began. His father's men seized him before word of the Queen's proclamation even reached them. The boy became a hostage to fortune, though he didn't understand it yet. He thought he was joining his father on campaign. He would learn otherwise. Cleopatra, too, discovered her son's absence the same morning she learned of her husband's retreat. The double blow might have broken a weaker woman. Her revolution had succeeded, but at a cost she hadn't calculated. The palace servants found her in the boy's chambers, holding his favourite toy soldier, completely still. Then she rose, arranged her crown, and went to meet her council. There was a kingdom to run, people to feed, borders to defend. The luxury of maternal grief would have to wait. This too was part of the Ptolemaic inheritance, the ability to function while your heart hemorrhaged. Messages arrived from Cyprus almost immediately. Ptolemy VIII offered terms, reasonable ones, considering joint rule restored, pardons for all rebels, even some of the Queen's reforms allowed to stand. All she had to do was acknowledge his primary authority, submit to his supremacy, welcome him back. The subtext was clear. Refuse, and young Memphites would pay the price. What would you have done? Your city finally free, your people finally hopeful, but your child in the hands of a man whose capacity for cruelty you knew better than anyone. Cleopatra II took 3 days to decide. 3 days when the whole kingdom held its breath. She refused. The Queen's letter to Cyprus was a masterpiece of controlled defiance. She acknowledged Ptolemy VIII as her son's father, but not as Egypt's rightful king. She offered him comfortable exile, a generous pension, even regular visits with Memphites. But Alexandria would never again suffer under his rule. When the herald finished reading her response to Ptolemy VIII, the exiled king smiled. His courtiers reported it was the first genuine expression they'd seen from him since the rebellion began. He dismissed everyone except his most trusted advisors. And in that private chamber, he began to plan something that would echo through history. Cleopatra II ruled Alexandria with increasing confidence as months passed without response from Cyprus. She instituted reforms that would have been impossible under the Triple Crown, let alone her husband's sole rule. The city thrived. Trade flourished. For the first time in generations, Egyptians spoke of their ruler with genuine affection rather than fear. But in the palace private quarters, the Queen paid the price for her public triumph. Servants found her standing at windows that faced east toward Cyprus. She kept Memphites' room exactly as he'd left it. Sometimes, late at night, they heard her voice from behind closed doors, speaking to emptiness as if her son might answer. A year passed. The kingdom settled into its new reality. Even Ptolemy VIII's most ardent supporters began to accept that the exile might be permanent. Plans were made for the future. A new co-ruler would need to be chosen, perhaps from the junior branches of the dynasty. Egypt required stability more than it needed any individual king. Then the ship arrived from Cyprus. It docked at dawn, flying diplomatic flags that guaranteed safe passage. A single messenger disembarked, carrying a sealed chest that required 2 men to lift. He requested immediate audience with the Queen, insisting his message couldn't wait for normal protocols. Cleopatra II received him in the throne room, surrounded by her council and guards. The messenger said nothing, simply placing the chest at the foot of her throne. Then he handed her a single papyrus scroll and withdrew to a safe distance. The message was brief. "Happy birthday, sister. Your loving brother returns what is rightfully yours." She'd forgotten it was her birthday. In the press of governance, personal calendar had ceased to matter, but Ptolemy VIII had remembered, had planned this moment with the same precision he once brought to military campaigns. The chest waited, innocuous in appearance. Cedar wood bound with bronze, the kind used for transporting valuable goods. Nothing about it suggested the horror within, but Cleopatra II knew. Before the locks were opened, before the lid was raised, she knew. Because she understood her brother, understood that for him, cruelty was art, that he would have spent months considering how to break her will in the most elaborate way possible. And what could be more elaborately cruel than this? She stood from her throne, descended the steps with perfect composure, knelt before the chest with the same grace she'd shown when tending Ptolemy VIII's fever all those years ago. Then, with her own hands, she opened her birthday gift. The silence that followed would enter legend. An entire throne room, dozens of hardened politicians and warriors, rendered mute by horror. The Queen didn't scream, didn't weep, didn't even close her eyes. She looked at what had been done to her son, with the same steady gaze she'd used to face every other Ptolemaic horror. Inside the chest, Ptolemy Memphites had been butchered with surgical precision, not hacked apart in rage, but carefully disassembled, like a puzzle meant to be reassembled. Each piece wrapped separately, labelled in Ptolemy VIII's own hand, as if he wanted to ensure she could reconstruct her son if she wished, as if reconstruction could undo this desecration. The councillors waited for her to break, her enemies prepared to seize power from a queen undone by grief. Her supporters readied themselves to catch her when she fell. Instead, she rose, turned to face the court with clear eyes and steady voice. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted in the balance of power. "Let all of Egypt see what Ptolemy VIII offers as governance," she said. "Let them understand the choice before them. This man who calls himself king has shown his true nature. He rules through the dismemberment of children. I offer you something different, justice that doesn't require innocent blood." She ordered the chest displayed in the public square, not the contents. Even in grief, she wouldn't dishonor her son's memory that way, but the chest itself, with proclamations describing what it contained and who had sent it. Let the people judge for themselves what kind of king Ptolemy VIII would be. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Whatever support the exiled king retained in Alexandria evaporated like morning mist. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers spoke of forming militias to defend against his return. The priests declared him cursed by every god in the Egyptian pantheon. But Cleopatra II knew her brother better than that. This wasn't a miscalculation on his part. This was strategy. He'd sacrificed his reputation to break her spirit. Gambled that a mother's grief would outweigh a queen's resolve, that she would agree to anything, accept any terms, to prevent further horrors. He was wrong. The queen buried her son with full royal honors. The entire city attended, a river of humanity following the funeral barge down the Nile. At the tomb, she spoke not of vengeance, but of transformation. How Egypt would honor Memphites by becoming everything his father was not: just, merciful, protective of innocence. Then she returned to the palace and prepared for war. Because war was coming. Ptolemy VIII wouldn't stay in Cyprus forever. He'd return with mercenaries and madness, ready to reclaim his throne over a mountain of corpses if necessary. The birthday gift had been a declaration as clear as any battlefield challenge. In the months that followed, Cleopatra II became something unprecedented in Ptolemaic history, a queen who ruled not through fear or divine mandate, but through genuine popular support. The people had seen the alternative. They'd looked into the chest and understood what choosing Ptolemy VIII would mean. She used this support brilliantly. When he finally invaded, landing with Cypriot troops at Pelusium, entire cities rose in her defense, not because she commanded it, but because they chose it. The war that followed was as much a popular uprising as a dynastic dispute. But wars are won by swords, not sentiment, and Ptolemy VIII had spent his exile gathering the sharpest swords money could buy. City by city, he carved his way back toward Alexandria, each victory marked by calculated atrocities designed to break the people's will. He understood his sister's source of power and set about systematically destroying it. The siege of Alexandria lasted 3 months. 3 months when Cleopatra II proved that a mother's grief could forge rather than break a queen. She walked the walls daily, visible to defender and attacker alike. She rationed food alongside her people. When the wells ran low, she drank the same bitter dregs as the poorest citizen. But mathematics are merciless. Walls can only hold so long. Defenders can only fight without food for so many days. The city that had risen in rebellion began to starve into submission. Ptolemy VIII's envoys made daily offers. Surrender, and the people would be spared. Resist, and Alexandria would burn as the harbour district once had. On the 87th day of siege, with the walls failing and the last granaries empty, Cleopatra II made her final choice as sole queen. She would not let her people suffer for her defiance. She would not let Alexandria burn for her grief. She would surrender. But even in surrender, she set terms that revealed how profoundly she'd changed the game. She would accept Ptolemy VIII as king again. She would even remain his queen, resuming their marriage as if rebellion had never happened. But she demanded witnesses. Roman witnesses. International acknowledgement of the terms of her surrender. It was brilliant in its simplicity. By inviting outside observation, she made Ptolemy VIII's future behavior a matter of international concern. He couldn't simply execute her without consequence. He couldn't purge Alexandria without Rome taking notice. She turned her surrender into a kind of protection for her people. Ptolemy VIII agreed. He had what he wanted: his throne restored, his queen subdued. The witnesses were a small price for victory. Besides, He knew something Cleopatra II had perhaps forgotten in her grief and defiance. In the Ptolemaic dynasty, all protections were temporary, all agreements were negotiable, all queens were replaceable. The reconciliation ceremony took place in the same throne room where she'd opened his birthday gift. Ptolemy VIII had ordered the chest placed prominently, a reminder of the price of defiance. Cleopatra II entered with the same composure she'd shown that terrible morning. She spoke the required words, acknowledged his supremacy, accepted his restoration. Then she did something unexpected. She walked to the chest, placed her hand upon it, and spoke directly to her returned husband. "This stays here," she said, "between us, always. A reminder of what you are capable of, and what I survived." The court held its breath. Ptolemy VIII could have ordered her executed on the spot for such defiance. Instead, he smiled. The same smile his courtiers had seen when she'd first refused his terms from Cyprus. "Of course, sister," he replied. "Let it remind us both." And so began the strangest phase of their marriage. Queen and king, wife and husband, mother and her son's butcher, ruling side by side. The chest sat between their thrones, polished cedar gleaming in the lamplight. Foreign ambassadors wondered at its significance. New courtiers learned quickly not to ask. Cleopatra II had survived the unsurvivable. She'd looked upon her dismembered son and chosen to continue, chosen to rule beside his killer, chosen to share the bed of the man who'd packaged a child like merchandise. Because that was what Ptolemaic queens did. They survived. But survival, she was learning, could take many forms, and sometimes the greatest revenge wasn't death, or exile, or revolution. Sometimes it was simply refusing to break, continuing to breathe, forcing your tormentor to see you every day, undefeated despite their worst efforts. Years passed. The chest remained. Egypt prospered despite its monstrous king, perhaps because of its unbreakable queen. Cleopatra II bore more children to Ptolemy VIII, though she never looked at them without remembering Memphis. She ruled with quiet effectiveness, while her husband indulged his appetites for cruelty elsewhere. But she was planning something, patient as the Nile's flooding, inevitable as its recession. She would teach the next generation what she'd learned through unbearable loss, that Ptolemaic women could be more than victims, more than survivors. They could be something their tormentors never expected. They could be memory itself, carrying forward not just bloodlines but lessons, creating queens who would remember every cruelty, learn from every survival, until one would come who could face down Rome itself. That queen was still unborn, but in the shadow of a chest that held a mother's worst nightmare, Cleopatra II was ensuring she would be possible. The monster festering in exile was about to retaliate with an act of cruelty so personal, so monstrous, that it would echo through the centuries and define the twisted legacy of the Ptolemaic throne forever. The messenger from Cyprus carried more than diplomatic papers. He carried the smell of death. Cleopatra II had been reviewing grain distributions when he arrived, her fingers tracing columns of numbers that meant survival for thousands. The throne room hummed with morning activity. Scribes scratched at papyrus. Advisors murmured over tax records. Normal sounds of a kingdom at peace. Then the doors opened and everything changed. The messenger's sandals left wet prints on the marble. Not water, something darker. His hands trembled as he set down the chest, and when he stepped back, Cleopatra noticed the stains on his tunic, as if he'd held something that leaked through cedar wood. "Happy birthday, sister. Your loving brother returns what is rightfully yours." 7 words, each one calculated for maximum cruelty. Ptolemy VIII had remembered what she'd forgotten in the exhaustion of defending her city. Today marked her 43rd year. In the Ptolemaic court, birthdays brought gifts of gold and ivory. But her brother had always been creative. The chest waited like a predator, beautiful cedar bound with bronze that caught the morning light, large enough to hold royal robes or ceremonial armor, large enough, her mother's instinct whispered, to hold a 12-year-old boy. She descended from the throne with deliberate grace, each step measured, controlled. The court watched in silence as their queen knelt before her birthday gift. Her hands didn't shake as she worked the locks. Years of Ptolemaic training had taught her that composure was armor, that breaking in public was a luxury queens couldn't afford. The lid lifted with a soft sigh. The smell hit first. Not decay exactly. Ptolemy VIII had been too careful for that. Something sharper. The herbs used to preserve sacred relics. The oils that kept flesh from corrupting. He'd wanted everything recognizable. Inside, wrapped in Syrian silk, lay the pieces of her son. The dismemberment had been performed with medical precision. Each joint carefully separated. Each piece labelled in Ptolemy VIII's own handwriting. Left arm of the traitor prince. Heart of the ungrateful son. As if he were cataloguing artifacts for a museum rather than butchering a child he'd once taught to hold a sword. The silence in the throne room became a living thing. Councillors who'd survived decades of palace intrigue found themselves unable to breathe. Guards who'd seen battlefield horrors turned their faces away. But Cleopatra II looked, forced herself to see everything, to understand the full measure of her brother's artistry. Memphites had been dressed in his favourite tunic when they'd taken him apart, the blue one, with silver threads that she'd commissioned for his last birthday. Now that same fabric wrapped around segments of what had been her beautiful, brilliant boy. She reached into the chest, touched what had been her son's hand, the fingers that had once gripped hers during thunderstorms, that had traced letters in wax tablets as he learned to write, still perfect in their stillness, still wearing the ring she'd given him when he'd left for the military camps, a mother's protection that had protected nothing. The court waited for her to scream, to rage, to collapse under the weight of a grief too vast for any human heart. Instead, she did something that would haunt every witness until their dying day. She smiled, not with joy, not with madness, but with a terrible understanding. This was Ptolemy VIII's masterstroke, not just the murder of her son, but the method, the timing, the presentation. He'd turned her child into a political statement, made Memphite's body into a message about the price of defiance. "Let all of Egypt see what Ptolemy VIII offers as governance," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the throne room. "Let them understand the choice before them. This man who calls himself king has shown his true nature. He rules through the dismemberment of children. I offer you something different, justice that doesn't require innocent blood." She stood, still smiling that terrible smile, gestured for her guards to lift the chest. They obeyed, though their hands shook. The entire court held its breath as she gave her next command. "Display it in the agora. Let every citizen see what their exiled king sends as birthday gifts. Let mothers understand what kind of ruler waits in Cyprus. Let fathers know what fate awaits their sons under his reign." The treasurer, an old man who'd served since the Triple Crown, found his voice. "Majesty, perhaps we should. That is, the people might." "The people," Cleopatra II interrupted gently, "deserve truth. They've bled for this rebellion. They've starved for their freedom. Let them see clearly what they've been fighting against." She turned back to the chest, reached in again. This time she lifted out a small scroll tied with black ribbon. Ptolemy VIII had included a personal note with his gift. She read it silently, her expression never changing. Then she handed it to her scribe. "Add this to the display. Let everyone read the king's own words." The scroll contained 3 lines. "The boy chose poorly. You chose worse. Choose better next time." The court dispersed in shocked silence. Servants appeared to clean the throne room floor where the chest had leaked its precious burden. But Cleopatra II remained, staring at the empty space where her son's remains had rested, calculating, planning, transforming grief into something harder and more useful. By noon, word had spread through Alexandria like wildfire. Citizens gathered in the agora, drawn by horror and disbelief. The chest sat on a raised platform surrounded by guards. The proclamations explaining its contents were read hourly. Ptolemy VIII's note was copied and distributed through every district. The city's reaction was immediate and visceral. Mothers wept openly. Fathers cursed the exiled king's name. Children were hurried past the display, though many caught glimpses that would haunt their dreams. This wasn't distant political theatre anymore. This was real. This was what Ptolemy VIII did to children who displeased him. In the palace, Cleopatra II received a stream of visitors. Nobles who'd been wavering in their support now pledged absolute loyalty. Merchants offered their wealth for the city's defense. Even criminals from the lower districts sent messages offering their blades for the queen who'd lost her son to a monster. She accepted them all with the same terrible smile, turned their rage into resources, their grief into determination. Ptolemy VIII had meant to break her will. Instead, he'd forged her into something unprecedented in Ptolemaic history, a queen who ruled through shared sorrow rather than fear. That night, she stood on the palace walls overlooking the harbour. The chest had been removed from public display, but crowds still lingered in the agora. Torches burned like fallen stars. Voices rose in songs of lamentation that gradually transformed into anthems of defiance. Her city grieved with her. Her city raged with her. "He's coming," she said to the captain of her guard. A statement, not a question. "Yes, Majesty. Our spies report he's gathering mercenaries in Cyprus. Syrians, Judeans, men with no loyalty except to gold." "How long?" 2 months, perhaps 3. Depends on the sailing season. 2 months to prepare for a war she couldn't win. Not with soldiers and walls. Alexandria had brave hearts, but Ptolemy VIII had professional killers. The mathematics of warfare were as merciless as the mathematics of siege. She needed something more than courage. She needed leverage. "Send messages to Rome," she commanded. "To Rhodes. To every power that trades in our harbours. Tell them what happened here today. Show them what kind of king waits to reclaim Egypt's throne." "Majesty," the captain hesitated. "Foreign powers care little for our domestic disputes. They care about stability, about trade routes, about dealing with predictable rulers rather than mad ones." She turned from the harbour view. "My brother just showed the world he'll butcher his own son for political gain. Make sure the world understands what that means for their interests." It was a desperate gambit. International opinion had never saved a Ptolemaic ruler before, but then, no Ptolemaic ruler had ever weaponized their own grief so effectively. Cleopatra II was writing new rules for an old game. The funeral came 3 days later. She'd had her son's remains carefully reconstructed, each piece reunited with its mate. The embalmers worked miracles, making Memphites appear almost peaceful in his sarcophagus, almost whole. Only those who looked closely could see the careful stitching that held him together. The entire city attended. The funeral procession stretched for miles. Cleopatra II walked behind the bier, unveiled, letting everyone see her dry eyes and straight spine. This wasn't a time for private grief. This was a public declaration. She would not break. Egypt would not break. Not for Ptolemy VIII. Not for anyone. At the tomb, she spoke words that would be carved in stone and memory alike. "Here lies Ptolemy Memphites, son of Egypt, victim of ambition, proof of what power costs when wielded without mercy. Let his bones bear witness. Let his silence speak louder than any battle cry. We do not bury him in defeat. We plant him like a seed. From his sacrifice, a different Egypt will grow." The priests performed the final rites with unusual fervor. They understood what the queen was doing, making her son sacred, transforming him from a murdered prince into a martyred symbol. Every prayer they chanted, every offering they burned, added weight to the narrative she was building. As the tomb was sealed, a strange sound rose from the crowd. Not weeping, not wailing, humming, low and wordless. A sound that came from thousands of throats united in something beyond grief. It rolled through the necropolis like thunder, reached the palace walls, echoed across the harbour where Ptolemy VIII's spies surely listened. Alexandria had found its voice, and that voice said, "Never again." But Cleopatra II knew better than to trust in public sentiment alone. Back in the palace, she set her deeper plans in motion. Messages flew to every nome in Egypt, not calls for soldiers, not demands for grain, something subtler. She told local administrators to prepare for a different kind of war, one fought in granaries and temples rather than battlefields. "When he comes," she told her council, "he'll expect resistance. Give him none. Open the gates. Welcome his armies. Let him think he's won." "Majesty," her military advisor protested, "the people expect us to fight, after what he did." "The people," she said quietly, "will learn that there are different kinds of victories and different kinds of defeats." She was planning something unprecedented. Not rebellion, not resistance. Something far more unsettling to a king who ruled through fear. She would give him exactly what he claimed to want, his throne, his power, his queen. But she would make them all taste like ashes. The preparations took shape in secret. Grain moved to hidden storehouses. Temple treasures vanished into crypts. The city's children were quietly sent to relatives in the countryside, all done so carefully that it seemed like normal administration rather than systematic preparation. Meanwhile, she performed her public role perfectly. The grieving but unbroken queen, leading ceremonies, dispensing justice, never mentioning her murdered son, but never letting anyone forget. The chest had been removed from the Agora, but its memory lingered like incense. Every time Ptolemy VIII's name was spoken, people remembered what had been inside. 6 weeks after the birthday gift arrived, the first reports came from the eastern frontier. Ptolemy VIII had landed at Pelusium with 8,000 mercenaries. Cities that had sworn eternal loyalty to the queen opened their gates without firing an arrow. The revolution was crumbling like sandcastles before the tide. "He's moving faster than expected," the captain reported. "Memphis has already fallen. He'll reach Alexandria within the month." "Good," Cleopatra II replied. The captain stared. "Majesty? Every city he takes without battle makes him overconfident. Every easy victory convinces him he's already won. Let him come. Let him think we're weak." She smiled. That terrible smile again. "The boy in that chest was my son, but he was also his. He's forgotten that. I'll make sure he remembers." The palace prepared for siege that never came. Instead, something stranger began to happen. As Ptolemy VIII's army approached, Alexandria seemed to exhale. Markets closed, houses emptied. By the time his forward scouts reached the walls, they found a city holding its breath. Cleopatra II gave her last public address from those same walls where she'd watched the harbour burn during the riots. But now no smoke rose, no crowds gathered, just her voice carrying across empty streets. "Citizens of Alexandria, your queen speaks to you one last time as a free woman. Tomorrow, the man who sent me my son in pieces returns. I will not ask you to die for me. I will not ask your children to share my child's fate. Open your gates. Bow your heads. Survive. That is my final command. Survive and remember." The echo of her words faded into silence. Then, from somewhere in the city, that strange humming began again, wordless, harmonious, spreading from district to district, until all of Alexandria vibrated with the sound. Not defiance, not surrender, something in between, something that made even hardened mercenaries shiver. That night, she prepared for her husband's return. Not with poison or daggers. Those were tools for queens who still believed in simple solutions. She dressed in the same gown she'd worn to receive his gift, placed the same crown on her head, arranged herself on the throne, where she'd smiled that terrible smile. The chest sat beside her, polished, empty, waiting. When Ptolemy VIII entered Alexandria, he would find exactly what he expected: a conquered city, a subdued queen, a throne waiting for him to reclaim. But he would also find something else, something that would gnaw at him every day of his restored reign. He would find a woman who refused to break, a city that remembered, a chest that would sit between them always, empty now but somehow heavier than when it had carried its terrible burden. The morning of his arrival dawned clear and still. No wind stirred the palace banners, no birds sang in the gardens. Alexandria waited like a held breath. And in the throne room, Cleopatra II sat with perfect stillness. The queen who'd survived the unsurvivable, who'd transformed a mother's grief into a weapon more subtle than swords. She'd learned the last lesson the Ptolemaic dynasty had to teach. Sometimes the greatest power isn't in fighting. Sometimes it's in making your enemy live with what they've done, in becoming the memory they can never escape, the ghost at every feast, the silence in every celebration. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Many footsteps, an army's worth. Her husband was coming home, and with him came a question that would echo through the remaining years of their impossible marriage. How does one recover from such a wound? How can a mother ever face her child's killer again? The answer waited in her terrible smile, in the empty chest, in the city's held breath. She would show him, and all of Egypt would watch. The impossible happened. The mother and the monster shared a throne again. 3 months after she opened that terrible birthday gift, Cleopatra II sat beside the man who'd sent it. The same throne room, the same marble floors where her son's blood had leaked through cedar wood, the same air that had once carried the weight of unspeakable horror. Now they ruled together as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The reconciliation ceremony itself told that story. No crowds cheered in the streets. No priests sang hymns of divine reunion. Just a handful of witnesses, mostly Roman, watching as Egypt's most broken marriage resumed its grotesque performance. Ptolemy VIII had aged during his exile. Not with years, but with something sharper. His face carried new lines that spoke of calculations made in sleepless nights, of victories that tasted wrong. He'd returned to find his throne waiting, his city subdued, his queen unbroken. That last part bothered him more than his spies reported. She wore the same gown she'd worn to receive his gift. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Every detail of her appearance was calculated to remind without accusing, to exist as living memory of what couldn't be undone. The cedar chest sat between their thrones, polished to shine like accusation. "You look well, sister," he said during that first formal dinner. "As do you, brother." Her voice carried the same tone she'd used to discuss grain supplies. "Cyprus must have agreed with you." The court held its breath. These were the first personal words they'd exchanged since the reconciliation. Everyone waited for venom, for rage, for something human to break through the political facade. Instead, they got something worse. Normalcy. As if mothers dining with their children's killers was simply another Tuesday in the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Roman observers found this more disturbing than any screaming match could have been. They'd come expecting Greek drama. Instead, they witnessed something that chilled them to their Mediterranean bones. 2 people who'd torn each other apart pretending to be whole. A performance of stability over an abyss of hatred. Days settled into routine. Ptolemy VIII handled military matters with his usual brutal efficiency. Cleopatra II managed domestic affairs with her characteristic grace. They appeared together at required ceremonies, shared the royal box at festivities, played their roles with such conviction that visiting dignitaries sometimes forgot the horror that lived between them. But the palace servants knew better. They saw how the queen's food tasters now worked in shifts of 3, how the king's wine was drawn from random amphoras each night, how neither ruler turned their back on the other, even in casual conversation. The marriage bed remained empty, separate chambers, separate guards, separate kitchens, preparing separate meals. The city adapted to this strange new reality. Markets reopened, trade resumed. Life continued with the resilience that marked every generation of Alexandrians. But something had shifted in the relationship between rulers and ruled. Where once there had been fear or devotion, now there was something more complex. A watching, a waiting. As if everyone understood this reconciliation was merely an intermission, not an ending. Then came the morning when Cleopatra II announced her pregnancy. The council meeting proceeded with routine business until the queen stood, placed a hand on her still flat belly, and delivered the news with the same tone she used for tax decrees. Another royal child would arrive before the year turned. The dynasty would continue. Ptolemy VIII's reaction became the stuff of whispered legend. His face went through transformations that his courtiers would spend years trying to decode. Surprise, calculation, something that might have been fear. Then, finally, that smile his enemies had learned to dread. "The gods bless our union," he said. "May this child bring Egypt the peace we all desire." But whose child was it? The court wondered in careful silence. The royal couple hadn't shared quarters since the reconciliation. The queen had been under constant watch, her every movement reported to the king's spies. Unless, the truth was simpler and more disturbing. During those first nights after Ptolemy VIII's return, before separate chambers were established, tradition had demanded consummation. The marriage needed to be legitimate in every sense, so they had performed that duty too. with the same mechanical precision they brought to joint rule. Now that performance had consequences. A child conceived not in passion or even hatred, but in the space between, a political necessity growing in a womb that had already borne one son to butchery. The palace mathematicians began calculating dates, the physicians prepared their chambers, and Cleopatra II carried new life, while sitting beside the man who'd destroyed her last one. She showed no special emotion about the pregnancy, continued her duties without acknowledging the changes in her body. But servants noticed new patterns, how she'd pause sometimes before the empty chest, how her hands would move protectively to her middle when Ptolemy VIII entered a room, how she'd taken to visiting temples dedicated to goddesses who protected children. The king watched these developments with interest that never quite became concern. He had what he wanted, after all: his throne, his power, his queen performing her role. If she'd found ways to make compliance feel like resistance, well, that was just another game to play. He'd always enjoyed games. Winter came early that year. The harbour winds carried unusual chill. Birds fled south in numbers that made the augurs mutter. But in the palace, the strange dance of reconciliation continued. Joint appearances, separate realities, the empty chest between them gathering dust and significance. The birth approached with the inevitability of flood season. Cleopatra II made her preparations with the same methodical care she brought to everything now. Selected midwives not for their skill alone but for their loyalty. Arranged for witnesses to the birth, ensuring no questions about legitimacy could arise. Even chose the room, not the royal birthing chamber where Memphis had drawn his first breath, but a different space, unmarked by memory. Ptolemy VIII made his own preparations. Doubled the palace guard, restricted access to the queen's quarters. Not to threaten, he assured the Roman observers, but to protect. After all, a pregnant queen was vulnerable. Enemies might seek to harm the dynasty's future. His concern seemed almost genuine if you didn't look too closely at his eyes. The child arrived during a thunderstorm that shook Alexandria's foundations. A daughter, the midwives announced. Healthy and strong despite the circumstances of her conception, Cleopatra II held her new daughter and allowed herself exactly one moment of visible emotion. Then the mask resumed. A princess for Egypt, another piece on the board. They named her Cleopatra III, another link in the chain of queens who'd learned to survive the unsurvivable. Another girl who'd grow up understanding that family meant danger and love was leverage. But for now, she was simply an infant whose cries echoed through palace halls that had heard too much silence. Ptolemy VIII visited his daughter exactly once, stood over the crib where she slept, studied her features with the same attention he gave to military maps. Then he nodded, satisfied that she bore enough resemblance to claim, and departed, his duty as father complete for now. But Cleopatra II had different plans for this child. In the quiet hours when the palace slept, she'd hold her daughter and whisper stories. Not fairy tales of princes and happiness, real stories, survival stories, the accumulated wisdom of Ptolemaic women encoded in lullabies. "Your brother tried to break me," she murmured one night, thinking herself unobserved. "He failed. Now you exist. Remember that. You exist because breaking isn't the same as bending, because surviving isn't the same as surrendering." A servant heard and remembered, passed the words along in whispers. They spread through Alexandria like seeds on wind. The queen wasn't just enduring, she was teaching, preparing, creating something new from the ashes of her grief. Meanwhile, the ordinary business of extraordinary cruelty continued. Ptolemy VIII executed rivals with creative enthusiasm. Cleopatra, too distributed grain with calculated mercy. They sat side by side at trials, dispensing justice that satisfied no one but maintained order. The empty chest watched it all, a silent third ruler whose authority grew with each passing day. Foreign ambassadors reported home about Egypt's stable instability. How could a kingdom function when its rulers clearly despised each other, yet performed unity so well that trade flourished and borders held firm against all threats, except the internal ones they'd made peace with, out of pure exhaustion? Then came the night when everything shifted again. A feast for visiting Phoenician merchants. Rich foods, flowing wine, entertainment carefully chosen to avoid any themes of family or loss. Ptolemy VIII, in expansive mood, telling war stories that grew more heroic with each cup. Cleopatra II playing the gracious hostess, ensuring every guest felt welcomed and watched. Between the third and fourth courses, she stood, the room quieted, expecting some formal toast. Instead, she walked to the chest, placed her hand on its polished lid, and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the banquet hall. "This stays between us always," she said, addressing her husband but performing for the crowd. "A reminder of what you are capable of, and what I survived." The Phoenicians didn't understand the reference, but they felt the weight of it, saw how Ptolemy VIII's knuckles whitened around his cup, how the queen's smile never wavered, how the entire Egyptian court seemed to stop breathing. This wasn't dinner conversation. This was declaration of war by other means. "Of course, sister," the king replied after a pause that lasted lifetimes. "Let it remind us both." She returned to her seat. The feast resumed, but something fundamental had shifted in the balance of their impossible marriage. She'd claimed the narrative, made his cruelty into her strength, transformed a weapon meant to break her into armor no one could pierce. After that night, the chest became something different in the palace mythology. Not just a reminder of horror, but a symbol of transformation. Servants touched it for luck when they thought no one was looking. Guards stood a little straighter when posted near it. Even visiting diplomats began to understand its significance, the way it sat between the royal thrones like a judge neither ruler could bribe. Cleopatra III grew in this atmosphere of crystallized tension, learned to walk in a throne room where her parents performed harmony while radiating hatred, spoke her first words in a palace where every phrase carried double meaning. By the time she could form sentences, she'd already absorbed the fundamental lesson of Ptolemaic women. Survival required becoming what tried to destroy you. Her mother had been sent horror in a box and transformed into something harder than cedar, stronger than bronze. Now she was teaching her daughter to be harder still, to carry forward not just blood, but the accumulated wisdom of women who'd faced the worst men could imagine and refused to break. The reconciliation lasted because it had to. Egypt needed stability. The dynasty required continuation. And perhaps most importantly, neither ruler could imagine an alternative that didn't end in mutual destruction. So they performed their roles, shared their throne, raised their daughter, pretended the chest between them was furniture rather than an accusation that would outlive them both. Years would pass before the next crisis. Years of careful choreography and calculated cooperation. But the lessons learned in those years would echo through generations, would shape queens yet unborn, would culminate in a woman who'd faced down Rome itself with skills inherited from a mother who'd smiled at her son's severed pieces. The reconciliation was both tragedy and triumph, proof that humans could endure the unendurable, evidence that sometimes the greatest victory was simply refusing to be defeated, and warning that in the Ptolemaic dynasty, even peace was just another form of war. This brutal legacy of resilience would be inherited by her descendants, carried in their blood like a gift and a curse, preparing them for horrors yet to come. Nearly a century after Cleopatra II reconciled with her son's killer, a new Cleopatra was born into this same world of gilded cages and bloody thrones. The year was 69 BCE. The palace where 7 generations had learned cruelty as curriculum stood unchanged. Same marble halls that had witnessed dismemberment. Same throne room where a mother had smiled at horror. Same dynasty, teaching its daughters that survival meant becoming harder than the men who would destroy them. But Alexandria itself was transforming. Roman merchants crowded the harbors, Latin mixed with Greek in the markets. The shadow of a new empire stretched across the Mediterranean, and everyone except the Ptolemies seemed to notice. They were too busy devouring each other to see the larger predator circling. This was the world that welcomed Cleopatra VII, last of her name, though no one knew it yet. Born to a father who would earn the nickname Auletes, the flute player, because he spent more time making music than managing his kingdom. History would remember her as simply Cleopatra, as if the 6 who came before were merely rehearsals for her performance. She entered life with advantages her ancestors could only dream of. No sibling marriage loomed in her immediate future. Her father had broken that particular tradition, marrying outside the family when palace intrigue made all his sisters unavailable through death or exile. The genetic spiral that had twisted through 7 generations paused, allowing fresh blood into veins that had grown too pure, too poisoned. The palace where she took her first steps thrummed with different energy than in Cleopatra II's time. Where once Egyptian nobility had held all the power, now Roman advisors whispered in every corridor. Where once the wealth of the Nile had seemed infinite, now loans from Roman bankers kept the government functioning. The cedar chest still sat between the twin thrones, but dust gathered in its carvings. New cruelties had replaced the old ones. Her early years unfolded in carefully managed chaos. Ptolemy XII, for the flute player was the 12th of that name, ruled with spectacular incompetence that would have been amusing if it weren't so dangerous. He'd inherited a kingdom already fractured by generations of family warfare. Instead of healing those divisions, he seemed determined to create new ones. Watch this young princess in the palace gardens. 6 years old, dark hair escaping from golden pins, studying the sacred lotus pools with intensity that made her tutors nervous. She wasn't watching the flowers. She was observing the fish beneath, learning which ones swam alone and which moved in schools, already calculating the mathematics of survival. Her education began before she could properly hold a stylus. Languages came first: Egyptian, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic. A Ptolemaic queen needed to speak to all her subjects, not just the Macedonian elite. Then mathematics, astronomy, philosophy. But woven through every lesson was the real curriculum, the stories of queens who'd come before. "Tell me about the chest," she demanded one afternoon, pointing through a window at the throne room. Her tutor, an elderly priest who'd served 3 Ptolemaic kings, hesitated. "That is a story for when you're older, Highness. I'm old enough to see it. I'm old enough to know." So he told her, carefully, with words chosen to inform without traumatizing, about great-great-grandmother Cleopatra II, about a birthday gift no mother should receive, about survival that looked like surrender but was actually victory. The young princess listened without interrupting, those dark eyes that would one day captivate Caesar absorbing every detail. She sat beside him afterward. The child's voice carried no judgment, only curiosity. Shared his throne, bore his children. She did what was necessary, Highness, as all queens must, and the chest remains to remind us, not a question, an understanding. That night, servants found her in the throne room, small fingers tracing the cedarwood's patterns, not with fear or revulsion, with something more unsettling in a child: recognition. As if she already understood she was heir to more than golden territory. She'd inherited the accumulated wisdom of women who'd transformed from victims into forces of nature. Her father's incompetence became her advanced education. By 10 years old, she accompanied him to council meetings, watching seasoned administrators work around rather than with their king. She learned to read the subtle glances between ministers, the careful phrases that meant opposite of their words. When Ptolemy XII played his flute instead of attending to urgent business, she studied the scrolls he ignored. Alexandria itself became her classroom. The great library, still magnificent despite centuries of decline, opened its doors to the curious princess. While her father's parties raged through palace nights, she disappeared into manuscripts that held the wisdom of ages. Herodotus taught her history. Homer showed her the power of story. Euclid revealed the elegant certainty of mathematics in a world where nothing else was certain. But her most important education came from the women who'd survived this palace before her. Not from books, but from whispers. The serving women who remembered. The priestesses who kept oral traditions. They taught her things no male tutor would think important. How to read the monthly flows that meant a woman was safe from pregnancy. Which herbs could prevent conception, which could end it. How to make cosmetics that enhanced beauty while testing for poison. She was 12 when the first crisis struck. Ptolemy XII had finally exhausted even Alexandria's legendary patience. His debts to Roman creditors had grown so massive that he'd sold Cyprus to pay the interest. Cyprus, ancient Ptolemaic territory, given away like a merchant's casual goods. The people erupted. The mob that surrounded the palace wasn't the organized resistance of Cleopatra II's time. This was pure rage, decades of mismanagement crystallizing into violence. They wanted their incompetent king's head. They'd settle for his exile. Young Cleopatra watched from a high window as her father fled. No dignity in his departure, no careful negotiation. Just a middle-aged man clutching his precious flute, scrambling aboard a ship while his subjects howled for his blood. He left behind 6 children and no clear succession. The mob would sort that out. What happened next would shape the future queen more than any dusty manuscript. Her older sister, Berenice IV, seized the throne with support from the Alexandrian mob. Berenice was everything their father wasn't. Decisive, ruthless, competent. She understood that in the Ptolemaic game, hesitation meant death. Cleopatra VII found herself in an impossible position. Too young to rule, too dangerous to ignore. Berenice couldn't simply execute her siblings. The mob that had installed her still held some notion of dynastic legitimacy, but she couldn't let them mature into threats either. So she chose a middle path. The younger royals would live under careful watch, prisoners in golden cages. For 3 years, Cleopatra VII navigated this precarious existence. Berenice ruled with increasing confidence, while their father begged Roman support for his restoration. The young princess learned patience, learned to make herself useful but not threatening, learned to smile at her sister's spies while planning for futures they couldn't imagine. She studied her captors as carefully as she'd once studied palace fish. Which guards could be charmed with Egyptian phrases? Which administrators missed the old stability? Which priests yearned for a ruler who understood tradition as well as power? Not actively plotting. Not yet. Just mapping the human terrain she might one day need to navigate. Then word came that changed everything. Ptolemy XII had succeeded in his begging. Roman legions marched on Alexandria. The flute player would return, backed by the iron fist of Aulus Gabinius and his lieutenant, a young cavalry officer named Mark Antony. Berenice prepared for war. Cleopatra prepared for opportunity. The siege was brief but decisive. Roman discipline shattered Egyptian resistance. Berenice, who'd ruled well for 3 years, died badly on the palace steps. Some said she fought to the end. Others whispered that her own guards, seeing which way the wind blew, opened their queen's throat to curry favour with the returning king. Ptolemy XII returned in triumph, carried through streets littered with the bodies of those who'd expelled him. His Roman creditors had their puppet restored. The debts that had caused the crisis remained, now swollen with interest and the cost of invasion. But none of that mattered to him. He had his throne, he had his flute, he had his revenge. The executions lasted weeks. Not just Berenice's supporters, but anyone who'd failed to actively resist her. The palace halls that had echoed with music now rang with screams. Cleopatra VII, reunited with her surviving siblings, learned another lesson. Being right meant nothing if you lacked the force to enforce it. Berenice had been the better ruler. Berenice was dead. Her father summoned his remaining children to the throne room, the same space where the cedar chest still sat today, where generations of Ptolemaic cruelty had played out. He wanted to ensure they understood their new reality, that he lived by Roman sufferance, that they lived by his. "You will marry your brother," he told Cleopatra, not bothering to specify which one. 2 survived, both named Ptolemy, both younger than her, both already showing signs of the weakness that would define them. "You will rule together when I die. You will maintain the dynasty." She bowed her head in acceptance. What else could she do? But behind lowered eyes, her mind was already working. She'd watched her competent sister die, watched her incompetent father triumph, learned that in the Game of Thrones, the rules were written by whoever commanded the strongest army. Her brothers were children, weak, jealous, easily manipulated children who saw their sister as threat rather than asset. The courtiers who would supposedly guide them were jackals, eager to feast on Egypt's corpse, and circling it all, Rome waited, patient as the desert, hungry as the sea. But she'd also learned other lessons, from Cleopatra II, who'd transformed survival into victory, from Berenice, whose competence had threatened too many interests. From her own father, whose spectacular failures had somehow led to restoration, the game had many moves beyond the obvious ones. At 15, she began preparing for a reign nobody expected to last, learning not just the theory of governance, but its practice. When her father was too drunk to meet with grain merchants, she appeared in his stead. When Roman creditors demanded audiences, she translated more than languages. She made herself indispensable to the machinery of government while appearing to be merely decorative. The Romans particularly underestimated her. These crude republicans, with their terror of monarchy, saw only another Oriental princess, destined to be married off and managed by men. They didn't notice her fluent Latin, didn't catch the references to their own history she'd drop into casual conversation, didn't realize she understood their politics better than they understood hers. She was 18 when Ptolemy XII finally expired. Decades of dissolution had rotted him from within. He died as he'd lived, badly, clutching his flute while failing to notice the kingdom slipping through his fingers. His final words were complaints about the wine. Even death couldn't give him dignity. The coronation that followed was everything Alexandria expected. Joint rulers, as tradition demanded, Cleopatra VII and Ptolemy XIII, sister and brother, wife and husband, bound together in the name of stability. The boy was 10 years old. The young woman was already ancient in her understanding of power, standing before the twin thrones, that cedar chest between them gathering its century of dust. She made private vows. She would not be Cleopatra II, enduring the unendurable. She would not be Berenice, competent but ultimately powerless. She would be something new, something the dynasty had been building toward through 7 generations of accumulated wisdom. She knew she could do better than her father, could govern with the competence Berenice had shown and the survival instinct of all her namesakes, could perhaps even break the cycle of familial destruction that had defined the Ptolemies since they'd first claimed Egypt. But first, she had to survive her brother, and the eunuch Pothinus, who controlled him, and the Roman Senate that saw Egypt as a prize waiting to be claimed, and the Alexandrian mob that had tasted royal blood and found it to their liking. The path forward lay through marriage to a boy who already resented her superiority, through ceremonies that proclaimed them equals while everyone knew the truth, through years of careful maneuvering in a court where yesterday's ally was tomorrow's assassin, unless word came on the winter winds. Upheaval in Rome, civil war between Caesar and Pompey, tearing the Republic apart. The powers that had restored her father now fought each other with desperate fury, and in that chaos, a woman of vision might find opportunity. She began to plan something audacious. Not just survival, not just competent rule, but a complete transformation of what it meant to be the last pharaoh of Egypt. It would require her to gamble everything on a single moment of pure theatre. As the most powerful man in the world sailed toward Egypt, she would make a gamble that would echo through history, proving once and for all that Ptolemaic women had learned to transform their darkest inheritances into weapons of unimaginable power. The docks of Alexandria thrummed with controlled chaos as Roman galleys crowded Egyptian merchant ships for harbour space. Salt spray mixed with the scent of papyrus and spices, creating the particular perfume of a port city where continents converged. Somewhere in this maze of rope and sail, a young queen planned an entrance that would redefine power itself. Cleopatra VII crouched in the shadows of a warehouse, watching Caesar's flagship bob at anchor. 21 years old, exiled from her own capital by her brother's counselors, she should have been desperate. Instead, she studied the Roman security patterns with the focus of a mathematician working through a complex proof. Guards changed shifts at the 3rd hour. Supply boats moved freely after sunset. Information worth a kingdom to a queen who understood timing was everything. Her companion, a Sicilian merchant named Apollodorus, shifted nervously beside her. He'd been paid well for this madness, but gold couldn't quiet the voice screaming that smuggling Egyptian royalty to Julius Caesar was an excellent way to end up crucified. The queen seemed unconcerned with his mortality or her own, her attention fixed entirely on the puzzle of reaching the most heavily guarded man in the Mediterranean. "The carpet is ready, Majesty," he whispered, "though I still say a formal embassy would be intercepted by my brother's men before reaching the harbour gate." Her voice carried the same certainty her ancestor had shown when choosing to bear children to her son's killer. Caesar expects supplicants. Pompey's head taught him that. I'll give him something unexpected instead. The severed head of Caesar's rival had arrived 2 days prior, pickled in brine and presented by Ptolemy XIII's advisors as proof of Egyptian loyalty. They'd expected gratitude. Caesar had wept, not for love of Pompey, but for the indignity of a Roman consul butchered by foreign eunuchs seeking favor. The boy king's counselors had misread their audience catastrophically. Now those same counselors controlled every approach to the palace. Pothinus the eunuch, Achilles the general, Theodotus the rhetorician, each one certain that keeping the queen from Caesar meant keeping their own heads attached. They understood power as they'd always known it, crude, direct, masculine. They never imagined it could arrive wrapped in Persian wool. Night fell like a theatre curtain. Alexandria's famous lighthouse painted silver paths across black water while the city settled into uneasy sleep. Roman soldiers patrolled the palace district. Egyptian guards manned the checkpoints. Between them, in spaces too small for armies but perfect for audacity, Cleopatra made her move. The carpet was expensive. Tyrian purple shot through with gold thread, the kind of luxury that opened doors and closed eyes. Apollodorus had papers claiming it was a gift from a Syrian merchant anxious to curry Roman favor. Guards would examine his documents, perhaps probe the bundle for weapons. They wouldn't expect the weapon to be wrapped inside, breathing carefully through loosely woven wool. She folded herself into the carpet with the efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this moment since watching her father flee Alexandria. Every joint positioned to avoid cramping. Every breath measured to prevent the fabric from moving suspiciously. The queen who'd once traced patterns on an ancient cedar chest now became cargo herself, transforming from person to package in service of a larger design. Apollodorus and his servants lifted their burden with practiced care. Real merchants would struggle with expensive goods. Too much ease would raise suspicion. They grunted and complained in proper proportion while navigating narrow streets toward the palace. The queen inside fought down childhood memories of hide-and-seek games that had always been preparation for deadlier concealment. The first checkpoint came at the harbour district's edge. Roman legionaries, bored with garrison duty, examined Apollodorus's papers by torchlight. One prodded the carpet bundle with his spear butt, missing the queen's ribs by a finger's width. She held her stillness like prayer, while sweat pooled in the small of her back. Heavy for a carpet, the soldier noted. His Latin carried the harsh accent of Gaul. Probably a veteran of Caesar's northern campaigns, now guarding southern prizes, filled with the dreams of silk merchants Dominus. Apollodorus's laugh sounded almost natural. They say Caesar appreciates beautiful things. We hope to encourage that appreciation. The Roman grunted, unimpressed by mercantile flattery. But the papers were in order. The appropriate bribes had been paid to the appropriate underlings. The carpet passed into the palace quarter while the queen inside counted heartbeats to stay calm. 3 more checkpoints. Egyptian guards who knew Apollodorus from years of harbour trading. Palace servants who recognized quality goods worth admitting. Each barrier passed brought them deeper into the complex where she'd been born, then exiled from, where her brother now played at kingship while real power rested with men who saw Egypt as a corpse to be divided. The final approach required different skills. Caesar had commandeered the royal guest quarters, close enough to the throne room for diplomatic convenience, far enough for security. His personal guard, the famous 10th Legion veterans, created a wall of Roman iron around their general. These men had followed Caesar from Gaul to Rubicon, to the edge of the world. They wouldn't be charmed by merchant smiles or Egyptian gold. Apollodorus presented himself at the final barrier with sweat-painting dark patches on his tunic. The centurion who examined his papers had eyes like a hawk and scars that spoke of survival through suspicion. He studied the documents, studied the merchant, studied the carpet that suddenly seemed to breathe with its own rhythm. "Know the liveries after sunset," he declared. "Come back tomorrow." "But Dominus," I was told Caesar himself requested. Caesar requests nothing from carpet sellers. The centurion's hand moved to his gladius hilt. "Leave. Now, before I decide you're too stupid to walk free in Alexandria. This was the moment. The calculation Cleopatra had made in the warehouse shadows. Caesar's men were incorruptible. Precisely. Which meant they'd report anything unusual directly to their general. And Julius Caesar, who'd conquered Gaul through audacity and crossed the Rubicon on a gamble, would recognize a kindred spirit. From inside the carpet came a sound, muffled but unmistakable. A woman's voice speaking perfect Latin with the cultured accent of Roman nobility. I invoke the right of royal audience. Tell Caesar that Cleopatra of Egypt requests the honor of his attention. The centurion's sword cleared its sheath in a motion too fast to follow. Other guards moved to surround the carpet bundle. Apollodorus dropped to his knees, babbling prayers in 3 languages. But through the chaos, one soldier remembered protocol. Unusual events required the general's attention. Caesar would decide the merchant's fate himself. They carried the carpet into Caesar's presence like a suspicious offering. The general sat at a desk covered in maps and correspondence, planning campaigns against dead rivals and living kingdoms. 52 years old, weathered by ambition and warfare, he'd thought himself beyond surprise. Egypt had already delivered shocks enough. Pompey's head, the boy king's fumbling cruelty, the wealth that made Rome's treasury look provincial. He looked up as his guards deposited their burden, took in the scene with eyes that had evaluated 1,000 battlefields, a terrified merchant, nervous soldiers, an expensive carpet that seemed to pulse with its own life. Well? Caesar's voice carried amused authority. Does someone plan to explain why my dinner has been interrupted by inferior Persian weaving? The carpet unrolled itself. Or rather, the woman inside unrolled it with movements that turned necessity into performance. She emerged like a butterfly from its chrysalis. If butterflies came armed with wit sharper than gladii and ambitions that dwarfed mere metamorphosis, Cleopatra stood before Caesar with dust in her hair and determination in her spine. Not the ethereal goddess Roman propaganda would later invent. A real woman who'd just spent an hour folded like laundry, whose muscles screamed from confinement, whose dignity had survived being bundled and carried like cargo. The same survival instinct that had kept her ancestor beside her child's killer now manifested as sheer audacious presence. Julius Caesar, she said in Latin pure as Roman rain, I am Cleopatra VII, rightful pharaoh of Egypt. My brother's advisors thought to keep us apart. They misunderstand both Roman determination and Ptolemaic resourcefulness. The room held its breath. The guards waited for orders. Apollodorus seemed to be trying to become invisible through fervent prayer. Caesar himself studied this young woman who'd transformed herself into contraband to reach him, who'd gambled everything on curiosity overcoming protocol. Then he smiled, the expression that had charmed senators and terrified Gauls. Your Majesty arrives unusually but effectively. Tell me, does Egyptian royalty always travel by carpet, or am I uniquely honored? You are unique in many ways, Caesar. She matched his smile with centuries of accumulated wisdom. Just as this meeting is unique in its possibilities. He gestured for his guards to lower their weapons. Apollodorus was dismissed with coins enough to buy silence and passage to anywhere but Alexandria. The soldiers resumed their posts outside, already composing reports that would become legends before dawn. Inside, 2 of history's most calculating minds took each other's measure. Caesar offered wine, Egyptian vintage, looted from the palace cellars. She accepted, noting how he served it himself, rather than trusting servants. They sat across from each other like players at a board where the pieces were kingdoms and the stakes were immortality. Your brother's counselors presented me with Pompey's head, he began. They seemed to think I'd appreciate the gesture. My brother's counselors are fools who mistake brutality for politics. She sipped the wine that had once filled her father's cups. They killed a Roman consul without understanding Rome, just as they exiled me without understanding Egypt. And you understand both. I understand necessity. The words carried weight heavier than her years. Rome needs Egypt's grain. Egypt needs Rome's protection. My brother offers you a child controlled by murderous eunuchs. I offer you an alliance between equals. Caesar laughed. It started as amusement at her presumption and became something more genuine. When did he last meet someone who spoke to power without cowering or condescending? This exile queen, still dusty from her carpet journey, negotiated as if she commanded legions rather than one terrified merchant's loyalty. Equals? He leaned forward, interested despite himself. I command 40,000 men. You command, forgive me, a rug. You command Romans far from home, dependent on supplies I control. Your civil war requires funding my treasury can provide. Your Senate despises you for crossing the Rubicon. She set down her cup with deliberate precision. I need restoration. You need legitimacy. Neither of us needs to pretend this is anything but mutual advantage. The frank assessment should have offended. Instead, it intrigued. Caesar had spent months among Eastern princes who promised submission while planning betrayal. Here sat a woman who offered partnership without pretending affection, who understood that the strongest alliances were built on reciprocal need rather than feigned devotion. Your brother holds the palace, Caesar noted. His advisors control the army. The Alexandrians remember your father with contempt. What exactly do you bring to this proposed alliance beyond audacity? She smiled then, not the calculated expression she'd worn since emerging from carpet concealment. Something deeper, more dangerous. The accumulated knowledge of 7 Cleopatras distilled into pure confidence. I bring legitimacy you can't manufacture with swords. I am Isis, reborn to Egyptian priests, Alexander's heir to Macedonian nobility, the rightful pharaoh to common people who remember my charity while my father played his flute. She paused, letting each identity sink in. But most importantly, I bring understanding of something your republic has forgotten. Which is, power isn't seized, it's performed. And I, Julius Caesar, give excellent performances. He considered her words while night sounds drifted through palace windows, Alexandria murmuring its ancient secrets, harbour bells marking time. Somewhere in the city, Ptolemy XIII's advisors were just learning their greatest fear had materialized. The queen had reached Caesar. Whatever happened now, the game had changed. A partnership, then, Caesar said finally. You need soldiers to reclaim your throne. I need legitimacy to justify remaining in Egypt. Together we might accomplish what neither could alone. Together, she agreed, understanding that word meant different things to each of them. For him, a temporary arrangement. For her, the first step in a longer dance that would outlive them both. They spent hours negotiating details. Which forces would move where? How to handle the boy king without triggering open revolt. The delicate matter of Roman interests balanced against Egyptian independence. She revealed intelligence gathered during her exile. He shared insights from decades of conquest. Both withheld as much as they revealed. Dawn approached when Caesar finally asked the question that mattered most. Not about troops or treasures or political arrangements. The personal curiosity of a man who'd seen enough to value the extraordinary. Why the carpet? You could have sent messages, arranged formal meetings. Why risk everything on theatrical arrival? Cleopatra stood, preparing to return to whatever safe house had sheltered her exile. At the door she turned, framed by early light that turned dust motes to gold. Because Caesar, you would have ignored messages. Formal meetings would have been intercepted. But a woman wrapped in purple and gold, delivered like gift or goddess. She smiled that dangerous smile again. That's a story worth telling. And stories, as your own career proves, can be more powerful than legions. She left him then, vanishing into Alexandria's awakening streets while his guards scrambled to provide discreet escort. Behind her, Caesar sat alone with maps that suddenly seemed less important than the conversation just concluded. He'd conquered Gaul through force, crossed the Rubicon through will. But Egypt might require different weapons entirely. The carpet remained in his chambers. Tyrian purple shot through with gold. A reminder that power came in unexpected packages. That the greatest gambles sometimes paid the highest dividends. That a queen who could transform herself into cargo might transform anything, given opportunity and alliance. Word spread through Alexandria like floodwater. The queen lived. The queen had met with Caesar. The queen would return. In the palace, a 10-year-old king raged at advisors who'd promised his sister would never again threaten his throne. In the temples, priests prepared for ceremonies they'd thought permanently postponed. In the streets, Citizens wondered whether this meant war or peace, or something harder to define. But in a modest house near the harbour, Cleopatra VII allowed herself one moment of pure triumph. The gamble had paid off. Caesar was intrigued. The game her ancestor had started with survival beside her son's killer would continue with stakes that dwarfed mere family drama. She'd risked everything on Roman curiosity and Ptolemaic audacity, and won, at least the first round. Many more remained. Armies to face, brothers to manage, Romans to seduce or subjugate. But she'd proven something crucial. 7 generations of accumulated wisdom could be weaponized. Every lesson learned in blood could be transformed into power. The carpet that had carried her was just the beginning. She needed to be more than a queen restored by Roman swords. She needed to transcend the mortality that claimed all Ptolemaic women eventually. She needed to become what Egypt required, what history would remember. She needed to become a god. The scent of frankincense drifted through Alexandria's harbour as ships bearing tributes from distant lands anchored in Egyptian waters. Gold from Nubia, spices from Arabia, silk from lands so far east they existed only in merchant tales, all flowing toward a queen who understood that power wasn't just held, it had to be seen, felt, breathed by every subject, from the delta marshes to the cataracts of the south. Cleopatra VII stood before a mirror of polished bronze, while priestesses adjusted the sacred vulture crown on her head. 25 years old, 4 years into her reign, she'd learned that survival required more than Roman soldiers or Egyptian gold. It demanded transformation, not just of herself, but of how 30,000 years of pharaonic tradition would manifest in an age when gods walked closer to earth than ever before. The reflection staring back wasn't merely a woman anymore. The kohl-rimmed eyes belonged to Isis incarnate. The golden Uraeus serpent coiled above her brow proclaimed her the living embodiment of divine protection. Every gesture had been rehearsed until it transcended human movement. She was becoming what her ancestor Cleopatra II could never imagine, not just a survivor of the system, but its apotheosis. "The processional barge is ready, Majesty," her chief priestess murmured. "The people line both banks of the canal. They've been waiting since before dawn. Since before dawn. Because gods didn't follow mortal schedules. They appeared when the cosmos demanded, and today the cosmos demanded a spectacle that would echo from Memphis to Rome. Caesar had left Egypt months ago, but his legacy remained in the sun, growing in her womb, and the stability his legions had carved from chaos. Now, she needed to transform military victory into something more permanent, something sacred. The palace corridors hummed with preparation as she made her way to the water gate. Servants scattered lotus petals in her path, each step crushing flowers that released perfume older than pyramids. Musicians tested instruments tuned to scales that induced religious ecstasy. Everything calculated to overwhelm mortal senses, to make the divine feel tangible. Outside, Alexandria steamed under the morning sunday. The city that had once rioted against her father now trembled with anticipation for their goddess queen. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken careful cultivation of the temples, strategic charity that arrived like divine providence, and most importantly, the resurrection of ceremonies that previous Ptolemies had let decay. The Ptolemaic rulers had always claimed divinity. It came with the throne, automatic as the double crown. But claiming and manifesting were different arts entirely. Where her father had worn godhood like an ill-fitting costume, she inhabited it, made it breathe, made it bleed when necessary. The barge waited like a floating temple. Gold leaf covered every surface that would catch sunlight. Sails dyed purple, not Tyrian purple, but the deeper shade achieved through Egyptian methods lost for centuries until she'd ordered their rediscovery. The vessel itself shaped like a celestial boat carrying the sun across the sky. Scaled for earthly water, but designed to evoke heavenly navigation. She ascended the gangplank with movements that seemed to defy gravity, each step deliberate yet ethereal. The crowd's murmur rose like incense. Mothers lifted children onto shoulders. Workers abandoned their labor to witness divinity in motion. Even Roman merchants, those paragons of republican skepticism, found themselves holding their breath. As the barge pushed off from the quay, She positioned herself at the prow where everyone could see their goddess sailing toward them. The morning light struck the gold of her crown and refracted into halos that dazzled mortal eyes. Priests had assured her the effect was carefully calculated. Angles of reflection, properties of metal, pure mathematics transformed into miracle. The canal stretched before them, both banks packed with humanity. 20,000, 30. Numbers ceased to matter when every face turned upward like flowers seeking Sunday. She raised one hand slowly, letting the motion ripple through air thick with expectation, and the crowd erupted. Not the angry roar that had driven her father into exile. This was worship, raw and real as the Nile mud that gave Egypt life. They shouted her names, all of them. Cleopatra, Isis, Mother of Egypt, Daughter of Ra, each title a thread binding her tighter to their needs and hopes and desperate wishes for stability in an unstable world. The barge moved through the city like a dream through sleeping minds. At each district she performed different aspects of the goddess. For the fishermen, she became Isis of the floods, promising abundant catches. For the merchants, Isis of the scales, ensuring honest trade. For the mothers, Isis who'd reassembled her husband's scattered pieces, a story they understood in their bones after generations of Ptolemaic violence. But the true power lay in what she didn't say, in the silence between gestures, in the space where human ended and divine began. The crowd filled those silences with their own needs, their own interpretations. She gave them a vessel to pour their faith into, and they filled it until it overflowed. At the temple of Ptah, the barge paused for the first major ceremony. Here, she would demonstrate that her divinity wasn't mere theatre, but had practical applications. The harvest had been poor this year, the inundation insufficient. Traditional offerings had failed to move the gods, but a living goddess could intercede directly. She descended from the barge, wearing robes that cost more than most Egyptians would see in a lifetime. But the expense was investment. Every golden thread proclaimed Egypt's wealth. Every jewel declared the kingdom's stability. The priests who received her had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Not just the rituals, but the rumors that would spread afterward. Inside the temple's sacred enclosure, away from public view, she shed the heavy crown and let them see her touch humanity. Sweat beaded on her forehead like any mortal's. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted the offering bowl. These glimpses of vulnerability, carefully deployed, made the divine performance more believable. Gods who never showed weakness were statues. Gods who overcame mortal frailty were worth worshipping. The ritual itself blended Egyptian tradition with Ptolemaic innovation. She spoke in the old tongue, words that predated Alexander's conquest, but she wore Greek robes beneath the Egyptian overlay, acknowledging the dual nature of her kingdom. When she called upon the gods, she used both hierarchies, Isis Aphrodite, Thoth Hermes, making each tradition reinforce the other rather than compete. The priests had been instructed to watch for signs. They found them. A hawk circled the temple at the precise moment she invoked Horus. The sacred pool rippled without wind when she blessed the waters. Later, skeptics would note that hawks always circled temples, hunting pigeons, and underground springs often caused unexplained ripples. But in the moment, with incense thick in the air and their goddess speaking words of power, even skeptics felt their certainty waver. She emerged from the temple transformed again. The humanity carefully revealed inside vanished beneath divine radiance. She carried a small flask of blessed water enough to sanctify the harbour, to ensure the fishing fleet's success, to prove that God still cared about mortal struggles. The crowd parted before her, like the sea before celestial command. Back on the barge, sailing toward the great harbour, she allowed herself a moment of calculation behind the serene mask. The morning was proceeding perfectly, too perfectly. Somewhere in this worshipping crowd were agents of her brother Ptolemy XIV, that weak child the Romans had forced her to marry for legitimacy. Somewhere were spies from Rome itself, watching to see if Egypt's queen grew too powerful for republican comfort. Let them watch. Let them see a goddess who filled her people's hearts. More importantly, let them see a queen who understood that hearts full of faith fought harder than hearts full of fear. When the next crisis came, and it would come, it always came in the land of the Ptolemies, She would have more than soldiers. She would have believers. The barge reached the harbour where the fishing fleet waited. Hundreds of vessels, from tiny one-man crafts to larger commercial ships, all flying banners of Isis, the goddess who protected sailors, all crewed by men who'd spent the morning drinking sacred wine and working themselves into religious fervour. She stood at the barge's highest point, visible to the entire fleet, and began the blessing. But this was more than ritual. This was economic policy disguised as religion. The words she spoke bound the fishermen to specific territories, prevented overfishing, established quotas that would ensure sustainable harvests. Divine law accomplished what secular decree could not. As she poured the blessed water into the harbour, a shaft of sunlight broke through clouds that had been gathering all morning. The timing was coincidental clouds, often formed over the Mediterranean at this hour. But the gasp from thousands of throats suggested providence. The goddess had opened the heavens. The fishing would be abundant. Egypt would eat. Isis has spoken, she declared, her voice carrying across water with trained projection that sounded like divine amplification. The nets will fill. The people will feast. But remember, what the goddess gives, she can reclaim. Honor the waters. Honor the quotas. Honor your queen who speaks with heaven's voice. The fleet erupted in celebration. Horns blasted, drums thundered. Men who'd been rivals an hour ago embraced as brothers in faith. She watched it all with satisfaction that never touched her painted features. Another constituency secured, another layer of power added to the construction she was building. But the real triumph came in the small moments. A child on her father's shoulders, reaching toward the goddess queen with eyes full of wonder. An old priestess weeping at the restoration of ceremonies she'd thought lost forever. A Roman merchant making the sign against evil, then glancing around to see if anyone noticed his superstition overcoming his skepticism. These were the building blocks of the future she envisioned. Not just political power, but mythological authority. When Rome finally came, and they would come, they always came for rich prizes. They would find more than a queen to conquer. They would find a goddess whose roots had grown too deep in Egyptian soil to be easily uprooted. The barge turned back toward the palace as noon approached. The ceremonies would continue for days, each one reinforcing her divine status, each one solving practical problems through sacred means. But first came the private ritual, the one that would determine whether all this pageantry had deeper purpose or was merely elaborate theatre. In her chambers, she dismissed everyone except Dioscorides, her physician, an old Greek who'd served the palace for 40 years. He'd seen enough Ptolemaic transformations to be immune to divine pretensions. He examined her with clinical detachment while she shed the goddess costume layer by layer. "The child?" she asked when his examination concluded. "Healthy and growing. You bear divinity well, Majesty." His tone suggested medical approval rather than religious awe, though perhaps fewer clouds of incense would benefit both mother and offspring. "Caesar's son must be born in proper splendor," she replied. "Rome will recognize him or not based on politics. But Egypt will embrace him as the merger of mortal and divine. That requires preparation." Dioscorides nodded, understanding the calculation. A child born to pageantry became part of the pageant, a bastard transformed through spectacle into a young god. It was ambitious beyond anything previous Ptolemaic queens had attempted. But then, previous queens hadn't needed to balance Roman power against Egyptian tradition. "There's more," he said carefully. "Your brother grows suspicious. His advisors whisper that your divinity threatens the traditional balance, that a living goddess shouldn't share power with a mortal king." She smiled, not the serene expression of Isis, but something sharper. "My brother misunderstands the situation. I don't share power. I perform sharing while accumulating the real thing. Let him play with his toy soldiers while I command heaven." But even as she spoke with confidence, she knew the danger. Ptolemy XIV was weak, but weak men committed desperate acts when cornered. And behind him stood Romans who preferred client kings to god queens. The divinity she was constructing could protect against many threats, but not all. That evening, as the palace settled into routine, she stood on her private balcony overlooking the harbour. The fishing fleet had sailed with the afternoon tide, blessed and bound by divine command. Temple fires burned across the city, each one a point of light in the growing constellation of her power. Yet doubts crept in like evening shadows. How much of what she performed did she actually believe? When she spoke as Isis, did some part of her touch the divine, or was it all careful choreography? The line between becoming a goddess and believing yourself one was thin as papyrus and twice as fragile. A knock interrupted her contemplation. Apollodorus entered, the same merchant who'd smuggled her to Caesar in a carpet. Now he served as her most trusted agent, the one who arranged what gods couldn't be seen organizing. His expression suggested urgent news. Majesty, ships from Rome. They carry word that changes everything. She turned from the harbor view, already calculating possibilities. Had Caesar's enemies finally moved against him? Had the Senate declared war on Egypt? Had her divine performance reached Roman ears and triggered Republican panic? Speak plainly, she commanded. What word could change what we've built here? Apollodorus swallowed, struggling with news too large for easy words. Caesar is dead, Majesty, assassinated in the Senate. Rome tears itself apart. And your son. He didn't need to finish. Her son, Caesar's son, had just become either the most valuable piece on the board or the most vulnerable. The careful construction of divinity she'd built would be tested by forces that cared nothing for Egyptian gods or Ptolemaic tradition. She stood perfectly still, processing this shift in the world's axis. Then, with movements that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, she began to transform again, not into Isis this time, into something harder and more necessary. A survivor, a calculator, a queen who would need every grain of accumulated wisdom to navigate the chaos ahead. Double the guard, she said quietly. Summon the priests, alert the fleet. If Rome burns, Egypt must be ready to either extinguish the flames or profit from the ashes. Apollodorus bowed and departed, leaving her alone with implications too vast for immediate comprehension. The divine theatre would continue. It had to, but now it served a different purpose. Not just to unite Egypt, but to make it indispensable to whatever power emerged from Roman chaos. In the harbour below, fishing boats disappeared into darkness, carrying her blessing and their faith toward uncertain waters. Tomorrow she would be Isis again, serene and certain. Tonight she was Cleopatra, last of 7 queens who'd learned that survival required constant transformation. And if Rome thought her divine pretensions made her weak, they would learn otherwise. They would learn what 7 generations of Ptolemaic women had carved into their daughters' souls. That power was indeed performance, but the best performances could reshape reality itself. The goddess was rising, and Rome, whether republic or empire, would reckon with what they'd helped create. A power not masculine or military, but something older and more enduring. Something that began with a woman in a carpet and would end. Well, that remained to be written, in blood or gold or ashes, but written by her hand, in her words, according to her will. Divine theatre had only just begun. The Roman Senate chamber echoed with accusations that would reshape the ancient world. Not through military conquest this time, but through something far more insidious. The systematic destruction of a woman's reputation, one calculated lie at a time. Octavian stood before the assembled senators, his boyish face masking political genius that would soon transform him into Augustus. 19 years old, heir to Caesar's name but not his charisma, he understood that wars were won with words before swords ever left their sheaths. And the words he chose that autumn day in 32 BCE would echo through 20 centuries. "She has bewitched our noble Antony," he declared, letting each syllable fall like drops of poison into eager ears. "This Eastern queen, with her potions and perversions, has stolen Roman virtue itself." The senators leaned forward, hungry for scandal that would justify what they already wanted. War with Egypt meant Egyptian gold, but war required righteousness, and righteousness required a villain. Octavian would give them one painted in cosmetics and crowned with foreign gods. Behind closed doors, his propagandists worked with the dedication of master craftsmen. They took the historical Cleopatra, a woman who spoke 9 languages and commanded fleets, and transformed her piece by piece into something Rome could despise without complication. Intelligence became cunning. Diplomacy became seduction. Power became perversion. You need to understand how this machinery operated. We're not talking about casual gossip or political mudslinging. This was systematic character assassination elevated to an art form. Octavian hired the best rhetoricians in Rome, men who could twist any truth into its opposite while making the transformation seem inevitable. They started with her bloodline. Those centuries of Ptolemaic marriages became evidence of barbarian degeneracy. Never mind that Rome's own patrician families had been intermarrying for generations. When Romans did it, it preserved noble blood. When Egyptians did it, it proved their fundamental corruption. The same action, two different stories, depending on who controlled the narrative. The physical descriptions began to shift as well. Contemporary accounts from travelers and ambassadors had noted Cleopatra's charisma, her wit, her ability to make anyone feel like the most important person in the world. Her beauty was mentioned, yes, but as secondary to her intellectual gifts. Octavian's machine ground those subtleties into dust. Suddenly she became irresistible, not through intelligence but through supernatural allure. Her voice could hypnotize strong men. Her perfumes contained aphrodisiacs unknown to decent Roman matrons. Every political alliance she'd crafted became proof of sexual manipulation. The propaganda was so effective that even today, 2,000 years later, we picture her as a seductress first, ruler second. In the taverns of Subura, paid storytellers spread increasingly lurid tales. Cleopatra bathed in ass's milk mixed with virgin blood. She dissolved pearls worth kingdoms in vinegar and drank them for breakfast. She held orgies that would make Bacchus blush. Each story more outrageous than the last, but repetition made them real in Roman minds. The genius lay in how these tales built upon existing Roman anxieties. The Republic was dying. Anyone could see that. Traditional values seemed to evaporate like morning mist. Roman women demanded more freedoms, more rights, more voice in public affairs. Who better to blame than a foreign queen who embodied everything conservative Romans feared? She became a symbol of Eastern decadence threatening Western virtue. Never mind that Alexandria's library held more wisdom than all of Rome. Never mind that Egypt's administrative systems made Roman governance look primitive. In Octavian's narrative, civilization flowed from west to east, and any reverse current threatened to drown Roman identity itself. The campaign reached its crescendo with Antony's will. How Octavian obtained this sacred document remains mysterious. Roman law protected such texts with religious sanction. Breaking those seals was sacrilege. But war has its own morality, and Octavian needed ammunition more powerful than rumors. He read the will aloud in the Senate, his voice trembling with manufactured outrage. Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria, not Rome. He'd granted kingdoms to his children by Cleopatra. Most damning of all, he'd declared Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, as Caesar's true heir. Each revelation landed like a physical blow on senators already primed for indignation. The masterstroke was making this about Antony's corruption rather than Cleopatra's ambition. She hadn't conquered the great general through military might. She'd infected him with Eastern weakness, destroyed his Roman virtue through feminine wiles. The narrative protected Roman pride while justifying unlimited violence against the corrupter. She feeds him potions that cloud his judgment, one senator declared. No true Roman would choose Alexandria over the Seven Hills unless his mind was poisoned. Another added, she practices witchcraft learned from Ethiopian sorcerers. Our noble Antony is not himself. He's her puppet, dancing to Egyptian strings. The story spread faster than any army could march. Within weeks, every corner of Roman territory buzzed with tales of the serpent queen who'd stolen their hero. Mothers frightened children with warnings about Eastern witches. Soldiers sharpened swords while imagining themselves as defenders of Roman purity against Oriental contamination. But we need to pause here and really consider what Octavian accomplished. He didn't just demonize an enemy. He created a template for every future character assassination. Take a powerful woman, reduce her to her sexuality, make her intelligence seem like cunning, her success like manipulation. It worked so well that we're still untangling these lies 2 millennia later. The irony cuts deep when you know the real Cleopatra, the woman who'd maintained Egypt's independence for nearly 20 years through sheer diplomatic brilliance, who'd navigated civil wars, Roman politics, and Ptolemaic traditions with skill that would have impressed Odysseus himself. All of that erased, replaced with a caricature designed to justify conquest. In Alexandria, word of the propaganda campaign reached the palace like smoke before fire. Cleopatra understood immediately what was happening. She'd studied Roman politics too long to mistake Octavian's intentions. This wasn't preparation for war. This was war itself, fought with weapons she couldn't counter. How do you fight lies that confirm what people want to believe? How do you prove you're not a witch when the accusation itself seems like something a witch would deny? Every response would be twisted into confirmation. If she maintained dignified silence, it proved her guilt. If she defended herself, it showed desperation. Octavian had created a trap with no escape. She tried anyway. Letters to reasonable Romans explaining the mutual benefits of the alliance with Antony. Economic arguments about grain supplies and trade routes. Appeals to the shared Hellenistic culture that should unite Alexandria and Rome rather than divide them. All swallowed by the propaganda machine and spit out as further evidence of her manipulative nature. Even her genuine accomplishments became proof of perversion. She'd restored Egypt's economy through careful management. Clearly she'd used dark arts to multiply gold. She'd built temples and supported scholars, obviously funding sorcerers and poisoners. She'd maintained peace in a region famous for conflict, the peace of the serpent, coiled and waiting to strike. The Roman people, primed by generations of suspicion toward powerful women, absorbed these stories like desert sand absorbing rain. Here was explanation for everything wrong with their world. Not systemic corruption or economic inequality or the inevitable collapse of republican institutions. Just one foreign woman and her feminine corruptions. Street corner orators competed to describe her perversions in ever more creative detail. She copulated with crocodiles to gain their power. She sacrificed Roman prisoners to dark gods. She planned to march on Rome itself, to make the Senate bow before her painted toes. Each story wilder than the last, but the wildness didn't matter. The narrative had taken hold. The final phase of Octavian's campaign targeted not just Cleopatra but the very idea of female power. His propagandists crafted careful comparisons between virtuous Roman matrons and this Eastern queen. Roman women stayed home, raised children, supported their husbands. Cleopatra commanded fleets, negotiated treaties, claimed divinity itself. The contrast was clear. One model led to stability, the other to chaos. They never mentioned the Roman women who'd wielded enormous power behind the scenes. Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi brothers, Servilia, Caesar's lover and political advisor, even Fulvia, Antony's previous wife, who'd led armies in her own name. But those were Roman women, exercising Roman power in Roman ways. Cleopatra's sin was being foreign while female while powerful. The combination was intolerable. By spring of 31 BCE, Octavian had won the propaganda war completely. The Senate granted him extraordinary powers to wage war not against Antony, their fellow Roman, but against Cleopatra alone. She was the enemy. She was the threat. Antony was merely her victim, to be rescued or destroyed depending on whether he remembered his Roman virtue in time. The declaration of war was read in the Forum to thunderous approval. Citizens who'd never seen Egypt or met an Egyptian howled for blood. The abstract idea of Cleopatra had become more real than the actual woman. She was no longer a person but a symbol of everything Romans feared about their changing world. Let her magic fail against Roman steel, they chanted. Let her potions spill uselessly on honest earth. Let the witch queen learn what Rome does to those who corrupt our own. Octavian stood among them, accepting their rage as his due. He'd created this moment as surely as any playwright crafting a drama. But unlike theatre, this performance would end with real blood on real sand. The narrative he'd constructed demanded resolution, and only total victory would satisfy the mob he'd created. Yet even as he basked in success, Octavian understood something his supporters missed. The very effectiveness of his propaganda created its own dangers. He'd made Cleopatra larger than life, a mythical figure whose defeat would require mythical effort. If she was just a woman, killing her would be simple politics. But he'd transformed her into something more, a symbol, an idea, and ideas, as he would learn, were harder to kill than queens. At the Battle of Actium, two worlds collided: Roman discipline against Egyptian grandeur, Western propaganda against Eastern reality, the last pharaoh of Egypt against the future first emperor of Rome. But more than that, two versions of the same story crashed together in the waters off the Greek coast. Octavian's manufactured monster against the actual woman who'd spent 20 years doing what Ptolemaic women always did: surviving. The Mediterranean stretched black as papyrus ink beneath a moonless sky. 300 warships waited in darkness, their oars silent, their crews breathing in rhythm with waves that would soon turn red. Somewhere across that water, Mark Antony commanded 60,000 men who still believed in Egyptian gold and Roman virtue. They would learn before dawn that belief was a luxury history rarely afforded. Cleopatra stood on the deck of the Antonias, her flagship named for the man who'd chosen her over Rome. Gold leaf covered every surface of the massive vessel, but she'd ordered the torches extinguished. Let Octavian's scouts search for Egyptian splendor. They'd find only shadow until she wished otherwise. The silence felt alive with possibility. Each creak of rope against wood might signal the approach of enemy scouts. Each splash could herald the beginning of the end. She'd spent the night before battle in a dozen different ways across her 20-year reign. This time felt different, final, as if the sea itself understood that tomorrow would settle accounts 7 generations in the making. Her son Caesarion moved beside her in the darkness, 17 years old and bearing his father's profile like an accusation Rome couldn't ignore. She'd kept him close these final months, teaching him the lessons Ptolemaic women passed to their children: how to read the space between words, how to transform disadvantage into opportunity, how to survive when survival seemed impossible. But some lessons couldn't be taught with words. Some required the bitter teacher of experience, and dawn would bring either the harshest lesson or the last one. The men grow restless. Her admiral reported in whispers that wouldn't carry across water. They ask why we wait, why we don't attack while darkness favors us. She understood their eagerness. Egyptian sailors knew these waters like lovers knew each other's skin. Night combat would erase Octavian's numerical advantage, turn the battle into a knife fight where skill mattered more than strength. But she also understood what her admiral missed. Octavian needs daylight, she explained, needs witnesses for his performance. He's spent 3 years painting me as a monster. Now he must be seen slaying one. We give him his stage. The admiral shifted uncomfortably. Like most military men, he preferred simple equations: fleet size, wind direction, tactical advantage. The idea of deliberately surrendering benefits for theatrical purposes violated every principle of warfare he'd learned. But his queen had kept Egypt independent through methods that defied conventional wisdom. Perhaps this final gambit would prove equally inspired. Hours crawled past like wounded soldiers. The Egyptian fleet held position with discipline that would have impressed any Roman general. Not the chaos of barbarians that Octavian's propaganda promised, but the controlled patience of professionals who understood that wars turned on moments, and moments arrived when they chose, not when armies demanded. As the eastern horizon lightened from black to grey, shapes emerged from the darkness. Octavian's fleet spread across the horizon like a metallic plague. 400 ships to her 300, fresh Roman crews to her war-weary Egyptians. The mathematics of defeat written in wood and bronze and flesh. But mathematics had never been the only language of power. She'd learned that in a carpet, teaching Caesar that audacity could outweigh armies. She'd proved it through 20 years of impossible sovereignty, transforming a dying kingdom into Rome's equal through will and performance. This morning would test whether those lessons could translate into miracles. Antony's galley pulled alongside the Antonias as full dawn approached. He swung aboard with the easy grace of a man who'd spent half his life on ships. 53 years old, scarred by battles from Gaul to Parthia, he still moved like the cavalry officer who'd caught Caesar's eye decades ago. But shadows lurked beneath that confidence, doubts that Octavian's whispers had planted. Questions about whether he fought for love or manipulation, glory or delusion. "Your pilots say the wind will turn by midday," he said without preamble. "If we hold the line until then, we can break north, reach open water, make them chase us to Egypt, where we choose the ground." She heard what he didn't say, where they could delay the inevitable, where they could pretend this wasn't the last gathering of their strength, where they could perform defiance a little longer before reality crushed performance into historical footnote. "The wind obeys its own will," she replied, "as do Romans when they smell victory." He flinched at that. The great Mark Antony, who'd stood with Caesar at Alesia and avenged him at Philippi, flinched at the suggestion that Romans might include him no longer. Octavian's poison had worked deeper than either acknowledged. The narrative of the corrupted general had taken root even in its supposed victim. "Signal the fleet," she commanded, not waiting for his agreement. "Form the line. Let Rome see what they've come to destroy." The flags went up, and 300 ships responded with mechanical precision. Egyptian vessels heavy with grain that could feed armies. Phoenician merchants pressed into military service. Greek admirals who'd chosen Alexandria's gold over Rome's iron. A coalition bound by pragmatism rather than patriotism, facing an enemy united by carefully cultivated hatred. As morning sun painted the water gold, both fleets arranged themselves for the deadly dance. But something unexpected happened. Instead of the aggressive charge Roman doctrine demanded, Octavian's forces held position, waiting, watching, as if they too understood this battle was as much performance as combat. She realized then what Octavian was doing. He wanted her to attack first, wanted history to record that the Witch Queen struck the initial blow, that Rome merely defended itself against Eastern aggression. Even here, at the moment of truth, he thought in terms of narrative rather than tactics. "He gives us the weather gauge," Antony observed, professional interest overcoming personal anguish. "We could envelope his flanks, drive him against the coast." But she was watching the small boats moving between Octavian's ships. Not combat vessels, but something more dangerous. Observers, historians. Men who would record this day not as it was, but as Rome needed it to be. They would note every detail that confirmed the story already written. The golden excess of Egyptian ships, the foreign faces of their crews, the woman who dared command where tradition demanded she submit. The trap was perfect. Attack and confirm her aggression. Retreat and prove her cowardice. Wait and let Roman discipline slowly strangle Egyptian morale. Every choice led to a different verse of the same song. Octavian had learned well the lesson she'd taught in Caesar's chamber. Power was performance. But he'd added a Roman innovation. The winner got to write the script retroactively. "Signal Antony's squadron to advance," she ordered, "but slowly. Make them come to us." It was the only move available. Force Octavian to act first, or watch his carefully maintained coalition fracture from inaction. Roman soldiers expected Roman aggression. Make them wait long enough, and they'd question why they'd sailed so far to not fight the monster their leader had promised them. The Egyptian center crept forward, oars dipping in rhythm that seemed more ceremonial than tactical. Antony's flagship led, his personal standard flying beside Egyptian royal purple. Behind him, the heaviest warships in the combined fleet moved like floating fortresses. Impressive, intimidating. Exactly the display of Oriental might Octavian's propaganda had prepared Rome to despise. For an hour, this strange ballet continued. Two fleets posturing like dancers who'd forgotten their choreography. The sun climbed higher. The wind remained stubbornly calm. Men who'd prepared to die grew confused at the delay. Some began to wonder if their leaders had lost courage. Others suspected deeper strategy beyond their understanding. Then the moment came, not from command or careful planning, but from the simple friction of proximity. An Egyptian ship drifted too close to Octavian's line. A Roman archer, nervous or eager, loosed an arrow. It struck Egyptian wood with a sound like fate knocking, and suddenly, as if that small impact had shattered invisible restraints, both fleets erupted into motion. But even as bronze rams sought wooden hulls, as arrows filled the air like migrating birds, as men screamed war cries in a dozen languages, she noticed something wrong. Part of Octavian's fleet wasn't engaging. His left wing held back, maintaining formation but not advancing, as if waiting for something, or someone. The realization struck like cold water. This wasn't a battle, this was an ambush, but not the military kind. Octavian didn't need to defeat her fleet. He needed her to do something that would justify everything that came after, something that would prove his propaganda prophetic. She turned to order countermeasures, but the command died on her lips. Behind them, barely visible through the smoke of burning pitch, sails appeared. Fresh sails. Roman sails. The second fleet Octavian had hidden beyond the horizon, now closing the trap she'd sailed into with eyes wide open. "Signal the reserve," Antony shouted over the chaos. "Form square. We can hold until the wind." "There is no wind coming," she said quietly. "There never was. This was always the plan. His and ours both." He stared at her, not understanding. How could she be so calm when death approached from two directions? How could she speak of plans when everything collapsed around them? But then, he'd never truly understood the woman he'd loved. Never grasped that for Ptolemaic queens, the worst outcome wasn't death but irrelevance. And Octavian had given her the opposite of irrelevance. He'd made her eternal. She gathered her purple cloak, the one that marked her as pharaoh and queen and goddess all at once, moved to the ship's highest point where everyone, friend and foe alike, could see her. Where those historians in their little boats could record her final performance. Where 20 centuries of storytellers would place her when they spoke of this moment. "Break through," she commanded. "All ships. Make for open water." It was the order everyone had waited for and no one expected. Not retreat exactly. Something more elegant and infinitely more damaging to Octavian's narrative. She wouldn't give him his last stand. Wouldn't play the cornered monster fighting to extinction. She would leave. Simply leave. And make him explain to Rome why the witch queen he'd promised to destroy had sailed away while he watched. Antony understood immediately. Understood and hated and loved her for it in the same moment. This was her final transformation. Not into a goddess or monster, or any of the roles others had written. Into something simpler and more powerful. A woman who refused to follow anyone's script but her own. The Egyptian ships turned as one, their discipline holding even as Roman rams struck home. Those that could broke free. Those that couldn't bought time for their sisters. And at the center, the Antonias burst through Octavian's line, like a golden spear through parchment. Behind them, Antony made his own choice. He could stay, die gloriously among Romans who no longer claimed him, or follow the woman who taught him that glory was just another word for following someone else's rules. He chose her, chose transformation over tradition, chose to be remembered as her fool rather than Rome's hero. They sailed south while behind them the battle became a slaughter. Those who couldn't break free fought with the fury of men who knew their story was ending. But for the queen racing toward Egypt with a fraction of her fleet, the story was entering its final act. Not the one Octavian had written, not the one history would record, but the one she'd chosen for herself. In the distance, smoke rose from burning ships. Men died calling on gods who didn't answer. The Mediterranean, which had carried Phoenician merchants and Greek philosophers and Roman legions, now carried the end of the last independent kingdom in its sphere. But it also carried something else. A woman who'd refused her assigned role in someone else's drama. "Alexandria," she said to the wind that finally filled their sails. "We make for Alexandria," where she would write her own ending, where the cedar chest waited between empty thrones, where 7 generations of women who'd survived the unsurvivable had prepared the ground for one final transformation. The serpent was going home, and when Rome followed, they would find something none of their stories had prepared them for. A woman ready to die on her own terms.